Good evening and welcome. Settle yourself now. Let the pillow take the weight of your head, let your shoulders come down away from your ears, and let the room go quiet around you. Tonight, we are going to travel a very long way back, and we are going to go slowly, because there is no hurry at all. 400 years is a long time to cross, and we have all night. This is the entire story of Roman Britain, from the first grey morning when the ships came out of the mist to the last cold hearth in the last emptied villa, and more than that, it is the story of what those centuries were actually like to live inside. Not the marble version, not the version carved on triumphal arches, the version with wet boots in it, and wood smoke, and the smell of barley porridge on a cold morning, and a soldier at the edge of the world writing home to ask his brother to send socks. That is the story. Let it come to you in pieces, and if you drift away in the middle of it, that is exactly right. The story will go on without you, gently, and you will not have missed anything you needed. Let us begin on a beach in the north of Gaul, in the spring of the year 43, on a morning when nothing had happened yet. There were 4 legions camped along the shore in the sand and the marram grass, perhaps 20,000 men under the eagles, and another 20,000 auxiliaries, and horses and mules and carts and grain in sacks. And a fleet of flat-bottomed transports drawn up on the strand, with their bellies in the wet sand and their masts bare. The men had been there for weeks. They had been told they were going to Britain, and they had refused to board. That is the true and rather human beginning of the whole thing, the most disciplined army in the world, the army that had walked to the Danube and the Euphrates and the edge of the Sahara, stood on a beach in the north and would not get into the boats, because beyond those boats was ocean, and ocean was not a sea in the way the Middle Sea was a sea. Ocean was the thing at the end of the map. Ocean had tides that rose and fell like something breathing. The men said, quite openly, that they were being asked to campaign outside the world. There was one young man among them, a legionary of the 2nd Legion, whose name we will use tonight as our thread through the first part of the story, and we will call him Quintus Vibena, because that is the sort of name he would have had. He was perhaps 22 years old. He was from a small hill town in the middle of Italy, where his father grew olives on a slope so steep that the mules complained. He had joined for the pay and the land grant at the end of 25 years, and he had been in the army for 4 of those years, and he had never yet been in a battle. He had spent those 4 years digging. That is what he mostly remembered about being a soldier, afterwards, when he was an old man with a farm in a province he had helped to make. Digging ditches and latrines, and the foundations of roads, he stood on the beach with the rest of them, and looked at the water, and did not want to get into the boat either. What broke the deadlock was not a general, it was a freed slave. The Emperor Claudius, back in Rome, sent his secretary, a former slave named Narcissus, all the way north to talk the army into the ships. And when this freedman climbed onto the platform where only a commander should stand, the legions began to laugh. They laughed at the sight of a freedman in the general's place, and they shouted the old carnival cry that slaves shouted at the winter festival when everything was turned upside down for a day. And the laughter did what threats and speeches had not done. Something loosened. The absurdity of it broke the fear. They stopped being frightened men and became an army with a joke to tell. And they went, laughing, into the boats. Quintus went with them. He remembered the smell of the ships most of all, pitch and wet rope, and the sour smell of 40 men who had been living in leather tents in the rain. They crossed in 3 divisions so that a single storm could not take the whole army, and they crossed at night, and the crossing was strange because there was no enemy on the other side. Nobody was waiting on the beach. The Britons had heard about the mutiny, had heard the invasion was cancelled, and had gone home to their farms for the sowing. So the greatest amphibious operation the ancient world had yet attempted came ashore on an empty shingle beach in Kent in the early light, unopposed, with the gulls complaining overhead, and the first thing the Roman army did on British soil was dig. Of course it did. Before anything else, before scouting, before food, they marked out a rectangle with coloured poles, and they cut a ditch around it, and they piled the spoil into a rampart, and they set stakes along the top, and by the time the sun was properly up there was a fortified camp on the beach, where 2 hours earlier there had been nothing but sand and grass. Quintus dug his section of ditch. He remembered that the soil near the shore was full of small round stones that turned the edge of his pick, and that his hands blistered in a new place, and that a man beside him, a Spaniard, kept saying that the light here was wrong, that it came from everywhere at once instead of from the sun. That is a real thing that southerners noticed about Britain, and went on noticing for 400 years. The light is diffuse here. On an overcast day it has no direction. It comes down through cloud like light through linen, and to a man raised under a hard Mediterranean sun, it feels like being inside a room with the shutters closed, all day for a season. Now what was this island they had come to? It was not empty, and it was not primitive, whatever the writers in Rome liked to imply. It was a landscape of farms. Most of the lowlands south and east had been cleared of forest centuries before, and it was a patchwork of small square fields with banks and ditches between them, and hedgerows and droveways worn deep into the chalk by the feet of cattle. There were perhaps 2 million people living here, perhaps rather more. They lived in round houses, and the round house is worth pausing on, because we tend to hear the word hut and think of something miserable, and it was not miserable at all. A good round house was a serious piece of engineering. A ring of oak posts, a low wall of wattle plastered with daub, and above that a conical roof of thatch rising to a point, sometimes 10 or 12 paces across inside, which is a bigger room than most people in most of history have slept in. There was no chimney, because a chimney would have pulled the fire too fast and set the thatch alight. Instead, the smoke rose and hung in the roof space and drifted out slowly through the thatch, and it kept the thatch dry and killed the insects in it, and it filled the upper air of the house with a blue haze that smelled of oak and hawthorn. The floor was beaten earth, swept hard, sometimes strewn with rushes. The fire was in the centre, in a hollow, and it never went out. That was the important thing. In a house with no matches, the fire was a possession, banked at night under ash and turf and coaxed awake in the morning with a handful of dry bracken and a great deal of patience. The whole family slept around it in a ring, feet inward, on low platforms with straw and hides and wool. A round house on a wet January night was warm, dim, smoky, close and safe. And if you had grown up in one, you would have found a Roman villa with its high ceilings and its stone floors an unbelievably cold and echoing place to try to sleep. These people farmed wheat and barley and spelt. They kept cattle above all, because cattle were wealth and could be counted and driven and given as gifts and stolen, and sheep and pigs that half looked after themselves in the woods, and small tough ponies. They ate a great deal of porridge and coarse bread and stewed meat and dairy, and they drank beer made from malted barley, weak and slightly sour and drunk by everyone including children, because it was safer than standing water, and it was food as much as drink. They worked iron beautifully. They made pottery on wheels. They minted their own gold coins with horses on them, abstract and flowing, and some of those coins carried the names of kings written in Latin letters, which tells you something important. Britain was not outside the Roman world before the invasion. It was already leaning against it. For nearly 100 years, since a much earlier general had come across twice and gone away again, the tribes of the southeast had been trading with Gaul across the narrow sea. They sent out grain, hides, hunting dogs, iron and slaves. They brought in wine in tall amphorae and fine red table pottery and silver cups and glass. There were British kings who had been to Rome. There were British princes fostered in Gaul who spoke Latin. And there were British exiles in Rome at that very moment, deposed by their rivals, asking politely and endlessly for a Roman army to come and put them back on their thrones. That is the ordinary, unromantic reason the ships came in the year 43. An emperor who had come to the throne in an undignified way, found hiding behind a curtain by the guard, needed a victory that everybody could see. Britain was famous, it was beyond ocean, it was mysterious to the crowd in the forum, and there was a ready-made invitation from an exiled prince. It was not a mystery of destiny. It was a new emperor needing a triumph, and an island that had been half in the orbit of Rome for 3 generations, and a spring tide, and a freedman making a joke on a beach. The army moved inland slowly, and slowly is the word to hold on to, because everything in this story happens at the speed of a walking man or a loaded ox. A legion on the march made perhaps 15 miles in a day, and then stopped in the early afternoon, with hours of daylight left, in order to build a camp. Every night. A ditch, a rampart, a palisade of stakes each man carried on his own back, gates at the 4 sides, tents in the same streets in the same order in every camp from the Rhine to the Nile, so that a man waking in the dark knew exactly where the latrine was, even if he had arrived after sunset in a country he had never seen. That is the real Roman genius, more than any battle, not brilliance. Routine, the ability to do an adequate thing identically, everywhere, forever. Quintus Vibenna's tent held 8 men and a mule to carry it. They cooked together, ate together, were punished together, and shared one small handmill for grinding the wheat ration, and the sound of that quern turning in the dusk, a low gritty rumble outside every tent in the camp, was the sound of the evening. The wheat ration was about 2 pounds a day, and the men made it into a flat coarse bread baked on a hot stone or into a thick porridge, and they had bacon, and hard cheese, and salt, and sour wine cut with water, which they drank because it was safer than the water alone, and because it reminded them of home. The first serious fighting came at a river the Britons had chosen to defend, a slow brown river through marshy meadows in what is now Kent. It took 2 days. 2 days is a very long battle for the ancient world, where most engagements were decided in an hour by which side lost its nerve first. The Britons had chariots, which the Romans found genuinely alarming and also rather old-fashioned, since nobody in the Mediterranean had used war chariots for 300 years. A British chariot was small and light, drawn by 2 ponies, driven by a skilled man with a warrior standing behind him. It was not a battering machine, it was a taxi. The driver raced along the line, the warrior threw javelins, and when the fighting closed in, the warrior jumped down and fought on foot while the driver waited at a distance to bring him out again. The noise of it was the point, the drumming of hooves and the rattle of wheels and the shouting, all designed to make the other side flinch. It did not make these particular men flinch, because a group of auxiliaries from the Rhineland, who could swim across a river in full equipment, went over in the night and hamstrung the chariot ponies in the water meadows before dawn. That is the sort of small, practical, unheroic thing that decides ancient battles. The Britons fell back to the Thames, and there they were on their own ground, because they knew where the causeways were through the marsh, and the Romans did not. The Roman advance stalled. And then it did something that looks strange until you understand it. It stopped and waited. For weeks, the commander sent word to Rome, and the Emperor Claudius came in person, all the way from the city, bringing with him the Praetorian Guard and a detachment of war elephants, and he arrived at the front, took command for 16 days, crossed the river, accepted the surrender of the great tribal capital at Camalodunum, received the submission of 11 British kings, and went home. 16 days. He was in Britain for just over 2 weeks in his entire life, and he named his son Britannicus for it, and put up an arch in Rome, and the whole enormous 4th-century business of Roman Britain hangs off that fortnight. Quintus, who had marched and dug for 4 months by then, watched the elephants come up the road through the older woods, and did not entirely believe what he was seeing. Neither did the Britons. That was rather the idea. Then the emperor went home, and the army got on with the actual work, which was not glory but administration. In the 4 years after the landing, Roman columns pushed west and north and took the whole of the south and Midlands, and behind them came something the Britons had never seen and would never entirely get used to. Straight lines. The surveyors came with a simple instrument, a cross of wood on a staff with plumb lines hanging from the arms, and with it they laid out roads that did not wander. This was the shock. Every track in Britain until that year had followed the land, curling around the wet ground and along the dry ridges, and the new roads went over the ridges and through the wet ground and out the other side, aiming at a point a day's march ahead that the surveyor had marked with a fire on a hilltop the night before. The road itself was a serious construction. First a strip cleared and the topsoil taken off, then a low embankment raised out of the local material so the road stood proud of the fields and shed water, then layers of packed stone growing finer towards the top. Then a running surface of gravel rolled hard, cambered so the rain ran off to ditches on either side. Some of them are still under our roads now. If you have ever driven a long straight stretch in the English Midlands and wondered why it is so unreasonably straight, that is a man with a wooden cross and a plumb line standing in a wet field 1900 years ago, refusing to go round a hill. Now let us leave the soldiers for a while and go to a farm on the edge of the new road, because this is where the real story is. There was a girl living in a round house near the great tribal capital in the east, in the country of the Trinovantes, and we will call her Senavara, which is a name we know a British woman really did carry, because it is written on a stone. She was about 9 when the ships came, old enough to remember the world before, young enough to grow up entirely inside the world after. Her family kept cattle and grew barley on the light soils. Her mother made cheese. Her father was a middling man in the tribe, neither a warrior nor a nobody, the sort of man who owed a few cattle upwards each year and was owed a few from below. When the news came that the great king had submitted, nothing at all happened to their farm on that day. That is worth saying. The conquest of Britain, for most of the people who lived through it, was not a catastrophe or a liberation. It was a series of small, cumulative, unignorable changes that arrived over about 10 years and rearranged everything without ever knocking on the door. The first change was the road, which came within sight of the farm in Senavara's 10th summer. A scar of chalk and gravel through the pasture, and with the road came traffic, and with traffic came the thing the traffic carried, which was tax. The second change was the census. Men came and counted. They counted people, cattle and land, and they wrote it down, and the writing was itself frightening in a society where nothing had ever been written down about ordinary people. Once you are on a list, you can be taxed, and once you can be taxed, you are inside the machine. The tax came in 2 forms, a land tax and a head tax, and in the early years it was often collected in kind, in grain, which meant carts going to a depot and a Roman clerk with a measuring vessel and a tally. It was not ruinous in a good year. In a bad year it was the difference between a hard winter and a hungry one, and it never adjusted for the weather, which is the complaint every farming society in history has made about every state. The third change was the money. Britain had coins already, but they were high-value gold and silver pieces used for gifts and dowries and tribute, not for buying a loaf. What came in now was small change. Bronze, coins worth a fraction of a day's labour, and small change is a revolution, because it means that for the first time you can sell 4 eggs. A market economy is not built out of gold. It is built out of the coin that buys a bowl of stew. Within a generation there were market days in new places, and the new places had names ending in a word that meant a walled town, and country people walked in with a basket and walked out with an iron blade or a red pot or a length of cloth, and walked home again along a road that did not curve. The fourth change was the biggest, and it took longer, and it arrived without anyone deciding to accept it. It was Latin. Not everywhere, and never completely. In the hills and the west and the far north people went on speaking the old British language for the whole 4 centuries and long after, and it survives today in Welsh and in Cornish and in Breton. But along the roads, in the towns, in the markets, in the army, and above all in any dealing with authority, the language was Latin, and it worked the way a language of business always works. First the traders learned some, then the ambitious learnt more. Then the children of the ambitious learned it properly and were embarrassed by their parents' accents, and that is how a province is made. Not by legions, by embarrassment. So let us go and stand inside that first generation and look around properly. Because this is the heart of what we came for tonight. What was life really like day to day in the province of Britannia in the first decades. Start with the town, because the town was the instrument of the whole project. Rome did not govern by sending administrators into the countryside. Rome had almost no administrators. The entire civil government of a province the size of Britain might amount to a governor, a finance officer, and a few dozen staff, plus soldiers seconded to police duties. That is nothing. You cannot run an island of 2 million people with a few dozen clerks. So Rome did not try. Instead, it made towns, and gave the towns councils, and made the councillors personally responsible for collecting the tax and maintaining the roads and running the courts, and then left them to it. The empire ran on local men who wanted to be important. The first towns rose fast. At the old tribal capital in the east, the legion moved on and left its fortress behind, and the fortress was handed over to retired soldiers as a colony, with the ditch filled in, and the barracks converted into houses, and the parade ground turned into a forum. That is a strange sort of place to live in, a town built inside the bones of a fort, with streets in a grid, because the barracks streets had been in a grid, and the veterans in it were men of 50, who had spent half their lives in the army and now had a plot of land. A discharged diploma in bronze, a British wife, and no idea what to do with the mornings. Around them the town filled with British people who had come in to sell and stayed to work. The new buildings went up in a way that must have looked astonishing. Rectangular. That is the first thing. Everything the Romans built was rectangular, and everything the Britons had built was round. And there is no deeper cultural difference in the whole story than that. A round house has no corners, no privacy, no separate rooms, one hearth, everybody together. A Roman townhouse has a corridor. It has a room you can be alone in. It has a door you can close on your children. When British families began to build rectangular houses, they were not just copying a fashion. They were changing the shape of family life, and it took 2 or 3 generations, and you can watch it happen in the ground, because archaeologists find farms where a round house and a rectangular house stand side by side for a while, as if the family could not quite decide, and then the round house is gone. Then there was the bathhouse. Nothing the Romans brought to Britain was adopted faster or more enthusiastically than hot water. A bathhouse was a public building, usually the best heated place in 100 miles, and going to it was the ordinary social event of the day, not a matter of cleanliness alone. You paid a small copper coin at the door. You undressed in a changing room with niches for your clothes, and, if you were sensible, a slave or a hired boy to watch them, because bathhouse theft was so common that people wrote curse tablets about it, folded sheets of lead scratched with a plea to a god to afflict whoever had taken their cloak. Then a warm room, then a hot room, thick with steam, where you sweated and were scraped down with a curved bronze blade. Oil first, and then the blade taking off the oil and the dirt together, since there was no soap as we know it. Then the cold plunge, sharp and shocking. Then out to the courtyard to sit in the sun if there was any sun, and talk. In a country where every native house was a smoky single room, the invention of a warm, bright place to be clean and idle in was not a small thing. It was probably the single most persuasive argument the Empire ever made in Britain. Underneath it all was the Hippocaust, and it is worth understanding because it comes back at the very end of our story. The floor of the hot room stood on hundreds of little pillars of stacked tile, leaving a space perhaps 2 feet high beneath. At one end a furnace burned outside the wall, tended by a slave who did nothing else all day but feed it and rake it. The hot gases ran under the floor, then up through hollow box tiles built into the walls and out at the roof. So the floor was hot, and the walls were warm, and you walked on wooden pattens because the floor could scald bare feet. It is central heating, invented before the birth of Christ, and after Rome left this island it would not be seen here again for well over 1,000 years. Senavara first went into a bathhouse at about 15, with an aunt who had married a man who sold hides to the army and had become, in the local phrase, one of the new people. She said afterwards that the thing she remembered was not the heat. It was the ceiling, She had never in her life been in a room where the ceiling was higher than a man could reach, and painted, and where the sound of voices came back off the plaster. She had spent every day of her life under thatch, which swallows sound. A vaulted room rings. Now, food. What did people actually eat? And did the conquest change it? The answer is that it changed at the top very fast and at the bottom very slowly, which is the answer to almost every question of this kind. The ordinary farming family went on eating what it had eaten, bread of coarse wheat or barley, ground at home on a hand-quern, which was heavy monotonous work that fell to women and took perhaps 2 hours a day for a family. Porridge. Stewed mutton or pork when an animal was killed, which was not often, since a living cow gives milk for years and a dead one gives meat for a fortnight. Cheese and curds. Beans, peas, cabbage, leeks, turnips, and the wild greens of the hedgerow that everybody knew and almost nobody wrote down. Apples, small and sharp. Hazelnuts in the autumn by the sackful. Honey, the only sweetener there was. Beer, always beer. But into this came a stream of new things, and some of them stayed forever. The Romans brought the domestic chicken in numbers, and the cultivated plum, and the sweet cherry, and the walnut, and the grape, and cabbages of better sorts, and carrots, and the broad bean in quantity, and above all they brought the idea of flavouring. The Roman kitchen was mad for sauce. The great sauce was made of fish, fermented in salt in the sun for months, until it broke down into a clear brown liquid. Salty and savoury and not fishy at all when it was good, and it went into everything. Meat, vegetables, even some sweet dishes, the way we use salt and stock together. It came to Britain in tall pottery jars from Spain, and you find the broken jars in every Roman town in this island, and someone at a fort on the northern frontier once wrote out an order for it in the middle of a list of ordinary supplies, so we know a soldier at the end of the world was eating fermented fish sauce from Spain on his porridge. There was wine which arrived by sea in enormous quantity and stayed a mark of status for 4 centuries, because the British climate is unreliable for vines, although people certainly tried, and there were vineyards here. There was olive oil, which had to come from Spain or North Africa, and which the Romans used for cooking, for lamps and for washing themselves, so a family's oil bill was a real thing. And there was the ordinary miracle of the market, which is that a farmer's daughter 20 miles from the sea could now buy a smooth red bowl made in Gaul, stamped on the base with the name of the man who made it, and eat off it. That red pottery is the signature of the age. It is fine, hard, glossy, and orange-red like a flower pot glazed with satin, made in enormous factories in Gaul and shipped in barrels packed with straw, and it turns up in the humblest farmsteads. It is not that everyone became rich, it is that mass production arrived, and mass production makes cheap things that look expensive, and human beings cannot resist them. Clothing changed less. The British had been weaving fine wool for a long time, and went on doing it, and the great British export to the continent for the whole Roman period was not gold or tin, but woolen cloth, especially a heavy hooded cape with a pointed hood that shed rain, which was mentioned by name in an imperial price list as a specialty of this province. Roman Britain's most famous product was a good raincoat. That tells you everything about the weather, and the weather is a character in this whole story. The men who came here from Italy and Spain and North Africa complained about it constantly. Not the cold, particularly, the damp. The way the wet gets into leather and rope and grain and bone. The way a wool cloak in Britain never quite dries between one rain and the next. The way the winter is not a hard, clean freeze, but 4 months of grey. 17 years after the landing, the whole arrangement nearly ended. It is worth telling gently, because it is the moment when the new province discovered what it had actually agreed to. In the east there was a tribe called the Iceni, in the flat country of reeds and wide skies, and they had come in as allies, rather than as conquered people. Their king had kept his throne under Roman protection, and when he died, he tried to protect his family with a will that left half his kingdom to his 2 daughters and half to the emperor, hoping that a gift to power would make power gentle. It did not work. because a client kingdom in Roman law did not descend to daughters, and because a great deal of money had been lent to British nobles in the confident early years by financiers in Rome, and those loans were now called in all at once. What followed was a sequence of humiliations, done not by an army but by clerks and agents and debt collectors, and they were done to the king's widow and her 2 daughters in a way that the Roman historians themselves recorded with shame. Her name was Boudica. She was, by the one description we have, a tall woman with a great mass of red hair to her waist and a hard voice, and she was probably in her 30s, and she had been a queen in a society where women could hold rank in their own right, which the Romans found genuinely difficult to process. She raised the Iceni, and the neighbouring Trinovantes rose with them, and the Trinovantes had their own grievance, because the veterans' colony had been built on their land, and the veterans had helped themselves to more of it, and in the middle of the colony stood a vast marble temple to the deified Emperor Claudius, which the local aristocracy were required to pay for. Nothing in the province was so hated as that temple. It was a tax on the conquered to worship the man who conquered them, and it never stopped. The rising went off like dry grass. The governor was far away in the west, in the mountains of Wales, attacking the island's stronghold of the Druids. The colony in the east had no wall, because the veterans had never thought they needed one, and a request for help brought 200 half-armed men. The town burned. Archaeologists digging in that city today go down through the modern surface, through medieval layers, through the later Roman layers, and then they hit a band of red and black, about the thickness of your hand, that runs under the whole city centre. Burnt daub fired to brick, charcoal, melted glass. They call it the destruction layer. There is one under the old port town on the Thames as well, and a third under the town at Verulamium. 3 cities, in a summer. The rebels then met the 9th Legion coming south to relieve the colony, and destroyed its infantry on the road. The governor rode ahead of his army back across the country, reached the port town on the Thames, looked at it, and made the coldest decision of his life, which was that it could not be held. He told the people who could march to come with him, and left the rest. The rebellion killed, by the Roman count, 70,000 people, and the number is surely exaggerated, and the reality was surely terrible. And then it ended, quickly, in a single afternoon somewhere in the Midlands, on a road we cannot now identify. The governor picked a place where a narrow field opened out of a wooded defile, so that his 10,000 men could not be outflanked by an army many times their size, and the British host came at him across open ground, with their families watching from a line of wagons at the rear. And the wagons were their undoing, because when the front rank recoiled there was nowhere to recoil to. Discipline beat numbers. It usually does, in the ancient world, when the ground is chosen well. And afterwards came the part that mattered more, because Rome then did something unusual. The governor began a punitive devastation of the eastern tribes, and the new finance officer of the province wrote to Rome and said, in effect, that a wasteland does not pay tax. He was heard. The governor was recalled on a pretext and replaced with a conciliator, and the province was rebuilt rather than broken. That is the Roman system working as it actually worked. Not mercy. Accountancy. But the effect on the ground was that the burnt towns were rebuilt bigger, with stone public buildings this time, and the port on the Thames rose again from its ashes and became within 20 years the largest city in the island and the seat of government. Senavara was 27 that summer, married, with a small son and another child coming. Her family's farm was in the country that rose, and afterwards the countryside there was very quiet for a long time. She lost a brother in the fighting and never spoke of which side he had been on, and her husband's cattle were taken by one army or the other. It hardly mattered which. What she said in her old age, or what a woman like her would have said, was that the Rising was the last time anybody seriously imagined that the world could be put back as it had been. After that the question stopped being whether to be Roman and became how to be Roman. Her son grew up in the rebuilt town. He had a Latin name as well as a British one, and used the Latin one in the market. He kept accounts. He was, by the standards of his grandfather, an entirely foreign creature, and by the standards of an Italian he was a provincial with an accent. And that double condition, at home in neither and comfortable in both, is what being Romano-British meant for the next 3.5 centuries. Now the armies went west and north. And this is the long grinding part of the story that nobody puts on an arch. Wales took 30 years. It is a country of steep valleys and hard people, and no plains to fight a battle on, and Rome took it the way Rome always took mountains, which is by building forts at every valley mouth and roads between them, and then simply staying, year after year, until the hills were netted. The great fortress in the southwest of Wales, the fortress in the northwest, the chain of small posts between them a day's march apart, and the copper and the gold and the lead that came out afterwards, worked by convicts and slaves under conditions no one wrote down. In the north there were the Brigantes, the largest tribe in the island, spread across the whole waste of the country. And for a generation they were held by treaty through a queen who kept the peace with Rome against her own nobles until her own consort turned her out. Then the treaty was gone, and the legions went north into the Pennines, and a great fortress was planted at the crossing of the rivers in the northeast, which would be the anchor of the whole northern command for 400 years. And then came a governor who is famous chiefly because his son-in-law was a historian and wrote a book about him. He pushed further than anyone had, into the far north, into the mountains and the sea locks, and in the 7th year of his command he brought the northern tribes to battle at a place we cannot find, on a hillside, and beat them. His fleet sailed round the top of the island and proved, for the first time, that Britain was an island. He built a line of forts across the narrow neck of the country and began an enormous legionary fortress at the mouth of a highland glen. And then, with the whole thing apparently in his hand, he was recalled. And the fortress at the glen mouth, which was half built, with its granaries up and its water pipes laid, was carefully dismantled by the men who had built it. They pulled the nails out of the timbers. They gathered up the nails, close to 1 million of them, 7 tons of iron, dug a pit in the workshop floor, buried the whole lot, and covered it over so the tribes could not have the iron. Then they walked south. That buried hoard was found again in the 1900s, and it is the most eloquent object in the whole of Roman Scotland, because it is the sound of an empire deciding that a place is not worth the price. For about 40 years after that withdrawal, the northern edge of the province was a vague and moving thing, a road with forts on it running across the narrow part of the island between 2 river estuaries, sometimes pushed forward, sometimes pulled back. A frontier that is a road is a frontier of intention rather than of stone. Then, 79 years after the landing, an emperor came to Britain in person for the second time in its history, and he was a very different sort of emperor from the one who had come with the elephants. Hadrian was a restless, clever, difficult man who spent more than half his reign travelling and his great policy, which broke with everything Rome had said about itself for 2 centuries, was that the empire was finished growing. No more conquest, fix the edges, hold what we have. He had already run a timber palisade through the German forests. He came to Britain in the summer, looked at the north, and gave the order that produced the most famous object in this island's ancient history. Build a wall, 80 Roman miles of it, sea to sea, across the narrowest practical neck of the country, from the mouth of one river in the east to the marshes of another in the west. 73 of our miles. It is worth sitting with the scale of that for a moment, because we say the words Hadrian's Wall so easily that the thing itself goes flat. Imagine a stone wall as tall as 2 men standing on each other's shoulders, running unbroken over crag and bog and river valley, for the distance a fit person could walk in 3 long days. In front of it, a ditch nearly 10 paces wide and 3 deep, cut through solid rock where rock was in the way, and in one stretch the soldiers gave up on the rock and left the ditch half finished with the tool marks still in it, and the abandoned lumps of stone are still lying there. Behind it, after a few years, an enormous flat-bottomed earthwork called the Vallum. 2 banks and a ditch, marking the rear boundary of the military zone. Along it, a small fortlet at every single Roman mile, with a gate through the wall, and between each pair of fortlets 2 turrets, so that a signal could be passed and a man was never far from a door. And then, once the design changed a few years in, 16 full forts astride the wall itself, each holding 500 or 1,000 men. The labour was done by the legions, and this is one of the loveliest details in the whole story, because the legions signed their work. Every gang of soldiers who finished a stretch set a stone into it recording which legion and which century had built that length, and hundreds of those stones survive. Some are plain, some are carved with little flourishes, a boar, a dolphin, a running figure, a joke. There are stones where the lettering starts out beautifully spaced and gets cramped at the end because the man laying it out ran out of room, which is a thing you have done yourself on a birthday card. 19 centuries later, the small vanity of a bored soldier is the reason we can map the construction sequence of the entire frontier. The building took perhaps 6 years for the main structure and a great deal longer for the rest, and the men who built it were not the men who then manned it. That is the second surprise. The legions, the citizen troops, built the wall and then went back to their fortresses in the rear. The wall was garrisoned by auxiliaries, the non-citizen regiments raised in every corner of the empire. And the roll call of who actually stood on Hadrian's wall is one of the most extraordinary lists in ancient history. Spaniards from the Asturian mountains, Gauls, Thracians from the Balkans, Batavians and Tungrians from the Rhine Delta, who were rated the finest infantry in the Western Empire. Dalmatians, Syrian archers from the desert edge, who wore conical helmets and shot composite bows, standing on a wet crag in Northumberland in February. A unit of Moors from North Africa, stationed at the western end, whose name is carved on a stone at the fort near the sands. And later drawn from a river tribe on the Danube, a regiment of boatmen who worshipped a god they had brought with them, and who, some believe, carried into Britain the horseman legend that would ripen 1,000 years later into something else entirely. This was the empire's real trick. Take men from the edge of the world, march them to the other edge of the world, pay them, and after 25 years give them citizenship. A Syrian who could not have voted for a village headman at home became, at retirement, a Roman citizen with a bronze diploma in 2 copies, one carried home and one filed in Rome, and his sons were citizens after him. The wall was manned by foreigners who were being slowly turned into Romans by the act of standing on it. Now, what was the wall for? This is the question people always ask, and the answer is more interesting than the one we expect. It was not a defensive rampart in the sense of a castle wall, and it was never intended that armies would be fought off from the top of it. There were too few men to hold 80 miles against a real assault, and the fighting doctrine of the Roman army was always to go out and meet an enemy in the open, never to cower behind masonry. It was first a customs post and a control line, a gate at every mile, and at each gate a bored soldier deciding who comes through, with what, and whether they have paid. It was a mechanism for taxing and regulating the movement of people and cattle across a frontier where there had always been movement. It was, second, a tripwire and a platform, a raised road that let signals and small forces move laterally faster than raiders could move north with stolen cattle, so that a raid could be intercepted on the way home when it was slow and burdened, rather than on the way out when it was fast. It was, third and not least, a statement. It said, in stone on the skyline, visible for miles, that the world was divided into inside and outside, and here is the line, and it is not moving. It was whitewashed, at least in places. There is evidence of a hard white render on the southern face, which means that on a clear day a man on the northern hills would have seen a white line drawn across the landscape from horizon to horizon. Imagine that, in a country where the largest built thing anyone had ever seen was a hill fort's earth bank. But here is the thing about a frontier, and this is the part that surprises people most. It leaked, deliberately, and it was busy. Trade went both ways through those gates every day. Roman goods pour out into the country north of the wall in the archaeological record, pottery and glass and brooches and coins, and the tribes north of the line were not sealed off from the empire. They were doing business with it, and some of their chiefs were on the Roman payroll as friendly kings. Cattle came south. Hides went south. Slaves went south. There was an economy on both sides of that wall, and the wall was its throat, not its wall. 20 years after it was finished, a new emperor, wanting a cheap military reputation, ordered the whole frontier moved 100 miles north to the narrow neck between the two firths, and a second wall was built there, of turf on a stone base, with forts closer together than on the first one. It was held for about 20 years, given up, briefly reoccupied, and given up again for good, and everybody came back to Hadrian's line, which was reopened and remanned and stayed the frontier for the next 250 years. That is a very human sequence. Build the enormous thing. Abandon it because a new man wants his own enormous thing. Come back to the first one because it was in the right place after all. The wall we walk on today, the one that runs along the crags with the blue lakes below and the windsill dropping away to the north, is a working structure that was continuously inhabited for longer than the time between Shakespeare and now. Children were born in those forts who grew old in them. There were families in the little towns that grew up outside the gates, whose great-great-grandparents had come from Syria and who had never seen the sun of Syria and never would. So let us go and live a day on the wall, because we can. We can do this with more confidence than almost any other daily life in the ancient world, and the reason is a miracle of mud. At a fort just south of the wall, in a valley where a stream cuts through, the ground is waterlogged clay, and waterlogged clay keeps out air, and without air nothing rots. Under that fort, layer upon layer, lie the floors of the earlier timber forts, and in those floors are the things the garrison threw away. Leather, textile, wood, and above all, thin slivers of birch and alder wood, about the size of a postcard and not much thicker than a fingernail, on which the garrison wrote their letters in ink. Hundreds of them. Thousands of fragments. Ordinary letters, written by ordinary people, about nothing in particular, from the years around the turn of the 2nd century, which is to say from a generation before the wall was even begun. It is the closest thing we will ever have to standing in the doorway and listening. Let us take a man from that garrison and follow him, and we will call him Flavinus Bracco, a trooper of a cavalry wing, born in the Rhine Delta, in Britain since he was 19, now 34, with a woman in the settlement outside the gate, and 2 children who speak 3 languages badly. He wakes before dawn. The barrack block is a long low building of timber and daub, later of stone, divided into rooms in pairs, and each pair houses a mess unit of 8 men in the infantry, or a cavalry troop's men and their gear. The inner room is for sleeping, the outer for equipment, and in a cavalry fort the horses are stabled in the same block, in the front room, with a soak-away pit for the urine, which means the men slept a doorway away from their horses, and everything they owned smelled of horse forever. It is cold. There is no glass in most of the windows, only shutters. There may be a small hearth or a brazier. The bedding is straw and wool and a heavy cloak. Outside, the trumpet. The day begins with the watchword being distributed, a slip of wood with a word on it, passed from unit to unit and returned, and with the roster. We have an actual strength report from that fort, written out on a wooden sheet, and it is the least glamorous and most illuminating document imaginable. Of a unit of some 750 men, it lists how many are present, and then where everybody else is, and the answer is that the majority of the regiment is not at the fort at all. Men are away at the provincial capital. Men are detached to the governor's guard. Men are at a supply depot. Men are gathering hides. And then the sick list, given by category, so many wounded, so many suffering from inflammation of the eyes, which was endemic in a world of wood smoke and no ventilation. That single document changes the whole picture. A Roman fort was not a barracks full of soldiers waiting for a battle. It was an administrative node, mostly empty, whose men were scattered across the province doing jobs. The jobs are on the tablets too. Duty rosters that assign men to the bathhouse, to the kilns, to the wagons, to the workshop, to the lime burning, to the hospital, to plastering, to shoemaking. A soldier's life was a life of tasks. Building, repairing, escorting, counting, fetching, the fighting was rare, and the paperwork was constant, and the army ran on lists in a way that would be entirely familiar to anybody who has worked in a large organisation. There is a letter about a consignment of wheat. There is a request for more nets. There is a memo noting that the roads are too bad for the wagons to move. There is a note from an officer complaining that his men have been beaten, which sounds dramatic until you read the rest and realise it is an appeal about jurisdiction and unfair treatment, essentially a grievance letter. And there is the one everybody loves, a letter from home, or from a friend at another posting, saying that he has sent socks and 2 pairs of sandals and underpants. Socks on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire in the year 100, somebody was worried about a friend's cold feet and put it in writing, and the writing survived because it fell in the mud. Flavinus's mourning is stable duty and then a work detail. Perhaps he is with the party going out to the quarry, 3 miles off, where the stone for a repair is being cut, and where a man with time on his hands has carved his name and a rude little face into the rock face, and where another, on another day, carved the words that translate as the rock of a certain soldier, which is graffiti pure and simple. Perhaps he is with the wagon escort going down the military road behind the wall. The military way runs the length of the frontier, and it is one of the most important parts of the design, because a wall without a road behind it is a fence, and a wall with a road behind it is a system. Midday, and the main meal. Contrary to the old idea that Roman soldiers were vegetarians who despised meat, the bone heaps at every fort in the north are enormous, and are mostly cattle, with sheep and pig, and deer and wildfowl, and at the coastal forts, oysters by the cartload. The oysters travelled inland too, packed wet in barrels, and you find oyster shells at forts 50 miles from the sea. The garrison ate bread from the fort's own bakery, which was set against the rampart to reduce fire risk, and drank beer brewed on the spot by a man whose job title, brewer, appears on a tablet, and also drank wine when it came, and there is a document listing the drinks bought over a period which shows a household getting through a very respectable quantity of both. There were spices, coriander from the Mediterranean, in the ground at these forts, pepper, all the way from India, mentioned in an account. A soldier at the top edge of the world in a rainstorm was seasoning his stew with pepper that had come by ship from the Malabar coast to Egypt, overland to the Nile, down to Alexandria, across the Middle Sea, up the coast of Gaul, and north by pack train. The empire was a machine for moving things a very long way. In the afternoon, the bathhouse which every fort had, always built outside the walls because of the fire risk, and which was the social centre of the garrison. Men gambled there. There were dice and boards for a game like draughts and counters, and men lost money and complained about it. In the corner of the fort was the hospital, a courtyard building of small identical rooms, and Roman military medicine was, within its limits, genuinely good. They knew how to clean and close a wound, how to extract a missile point with a spoon-shaped instrument designed for the purpose, how to set a fracture, how to amputate and cauterize. They had a large pharmacy of herbal preparations, some of which worked. They knew nothing about infection except that some places bred it, and so empirically they built their hospitals with lots of small rooms and good drains, and separated the sick, and it helped, and they never knew why. And in the middle of the fort stood the headquarters building, with a courtyard, a cross-hall for assemblies, and at the back a row of offices with a shrine in the centre. In that shrine were the standards, and below the shrine, in a sunken strong room with a heavy door, was the regimental pay chest and the men's savings, because soldiers were required to bank a portion of their pay with the standards, which meant the army held its own men's money, and a man who deserted lost his savings. It is a lovely piece of institutional cynicism dressed as religion. The gods stood over the safe. Outside the gate of every fort on that frontier there grew a village, and the villages are where the human story of the wall actually lives. They were not planned. They simply accreted, a straggle of long, narrow buildings with their gable ends to the road, shop fronts open at the street, workshops and living quarters behind. Tavern keepers. Butchers, a blacksmith, a leatherworker mending harness. Potters, women selling bread and beer and cooked food out of a hatch. Traders who followed the army the way gulls follow a plough. Fortune-tellers, prostitutes and families, because although Roman soldiers below the rank of centurion were legally forbidden to marry until well into the 2nd century, the law was a fiction that everyone from the emperor down ignored, and the men had women and children who lived 100 paces outside the gate and were not, on paper, anybody's wife or anybody's son. When the ban was finally lifted, nothing changed on the ground except the paperwork. In those villages the languages ran together: a Spanish trooper, a British wife from the hills, a Gaulish potter, a Greek-speaking merchant from the eastern provinces, and the common tongue between all of them was a rough soldier's Latin, thick with borrowed words, spoken with every accent on earth. And you can hear it, faintly, in the way British Latin words come down into Welsh, where the word for bridge, and the word for window, and the word for book, and the word for wall are all Latin words worn smooth by 1,500 years of use in a British mouth. Their gods were as mixed as their voices. This is one of my favourite parts of the whole Roman story, because Roman religion was not a faith you converted to. It was a practice, and it had room. If you came to Britain and found a local goddess in a spring, you did not deny her. You identified her with a Roman goddess you already knew, worshipped both under one hyphenated name, and carried on. So on that frontier we find altars to a god who is the Roman war god joined to a British name, and altars to a native god of a particular hill, and altars to a horned god, and everywhere altars set up by ordinary men in fulfillment of a vow, which is the standard formula, carved thousands of times, meaning simply, I asked. It happened. Here is what I promised. There was a spring on the wall sacred to a goddess of the water, and when it was excavated in the 18th century, they found the offerings still lying in the basin. More than 13,000 coins, brooches, rings, pins, small bronze horses. Altars set up by the commanders of the local regiments. Some of the coins had been deliberately bent before being thrown in, so that no one could take them out and spend them again. Which means somebody had thought about the theology of it. 1,500 years of people wishing at a well in the same place, and the well is still there. There was also, in the forts, a religion that spread through the army like a rumour, and it was the mystery of a god born from rock who killed a bull in a cave. Its meeting places were long, low, half-underground rooms, with benches down each side, and the bull-slaying scene at the end. Deliberately dark, deliberately close, warm from lamps and bodies. And there were 7 grades of initiation, and men rose through them by ordeal, and only men were admitted. And it was intensely popular with officers and merchants, which is to say with the sort of men who like ladders and secrets. 3 of its temples are known on the wall alone. One of them, on the crags, is a small stone room in a hollow in the moor, with 3 altars at the end. Stand in it now, with the wind coming over the ridge, and you can still feel that it was designed to make you feel that the world outside had gone away. Meanwhile there was Christianity, which arrives in Britain quietly and without a date, carried by traders and soldiers, illegal, marginal and stubborn, and which will be running the calendar by the end of our story. But that is 200 years ahead. Let us stay in the north for a moment longer, and think about what it was actually like to be a British person living beside all this. Because the great mistake in imagining Roman Britain is to think of Romans on one side and Britons on the other, when in truth the province spent 400 years quietly stirring them into one another until there was no line to draw. Take a shepherd's son from the hills behind the wall, and we will call him Tankerix, born in a farmstead of round houses on a spur above a beck, in a family that had been there for 100 generations. His grandfather had never used a coin. His father sold 3 cattle a year to the fort's quartermaster and was paid in silver, and hoarded the silver in a pot because he did not entirely trust it. Tancorix grew up hearing Latin at the gate and British at the hearth, learned to count in Latin because that is how prices are said, took work at 14 carrying lime for the mortar, married a woman from the village outside the fort, and lived in a rectangular building with a shop front. His own son enlisted. That is the arc, and it happened tens of thousands of times, and it happened without a single dramatic scene. The Empire did not usually take people. It absorbed the people who came towards it, because coming towards it paid better. But we should be honest about the other side of the ledger too, and this is a good place to say it plainly, quietly, without sentiment. This was a slave society. Every Roman town in Britain ran on unfree labour, and the slaves are almost invisible in the record precisely because nobody thought them worth recording. We have iron slave chains from British sites, gang chains with neck rings. We have a wooden writing tablet from the port town on the Thames recording the sale of a girl from Gaul, described as being in good health and warranted not to be a runaway, sold for 600 coins to a man who was himself somebody's assistant, which means a slave was buying a slave. We have curse tablets that mention runaways. The mines in the West used convict and slave labour, and the life expectancy in them was short. The great villas of the 4th century, which we are going to admire in a while, were run by people who did not choose to be there. When we say that a town had a bathhouse, somebody stoked it, in the dark, all day, for nothing, and we do not know that person's name, and never will. Hold that steadily alongside the mosaics. Both are true at once, and the mosaics are not less beautiful for it, and the person who stoked the furnace is not less real. There was also, threaded through everything, the ordinary presence of death in a way that is hard for us to feel. Perhaps a third of children died before their first birthday. Perhaps half did not reach adulthood. A woman faced childbirth without any effective intervention beyond skill and luck, and tombstones from Britain record women dying at 25 and 30 with the ages given in years, months and days, because when a life is short you count it finely. A tombstone from the fort at the mouth of the Eastern River was set up by a merchant from Palmyra in the Syrian desert for his wife, a British woman of a tribe from the Thames estuary whom he had bought as a slave, freed and married. He had her carved sitting in a high-backed chair with her jewellery box and her wool basket, in the Eastern style, and he wrote her name and her tribe and her age in Latin, and then, underneath, in the alphabet of his own city, 2,500 miles away, in his own language. He added one more line. It says, in Palmyrene, her name, and the words, alas, that is Roman Britain. A Syrian merchant on the North Sea coast, grieving in his mother tongue for a British woman, in letters that nobody around him could read. Now let us come south again, into the settled part of the province in its long good century, and see what the empire built when it was not worrying about anything. The 2nd century in lowland Britain is the period when the province stops being a military occupation and becomes a place. The port town on the Thames, burnt in the Rising, rebuilt itself into the largest city north of the Alps, outside a handful of continental capitals, with perhaps 30,000 people in it at its height. It had a bridge, the first bridge ever built across that river, on timber piles with a stone approach, and the whole trade of the province funneled over it. It had a forum and basilica complex that was, for a while, the largest such building north of the Alps, an aisled hall longer than most cathedrals, where the courts sat and the merchants argued. It had a governor's palace stepping down towards the river in terraces with an ornamental pool. It had an amphitheatre for perhaps 7,000 people, and the drains of that amphitheatre survive under a modern gallery, and in them were found the small things people drop at a show, a fragment of a gladiator's dedication, hobnails, coins, animal bone. It had quays. This is the part that always moves me most about that city, because we have the actual timbers. Great oak balks, squared, laid in stepped courses out into the river, extended again and again over 2 centuries as the trade grew, and the tree rings in them can be dated to the year the tree was felled. Ships came up on the tide from Gaul, from the Rhine mouth, from Spain, from the Mediterranean, and unloaded wine, oil, fish sauce, pottery, glass, marble, figs, and took out grain, wool, hides, lead, silver, hunting dogs and slaves, and the customs office took its cut, and the whole thing operated on credit and written contracts. We have hundreds of wooden tablets from that city's waterfront, the wax long gone but the stylus marks scratched through into the wood beneath, and they are financial documents. Loans, receipts, debts acknowledged. One of them is the earliest handwritten document ever found in Britain, a note about a debt, dated by the consuls of the year, which places it within a decade of the invasion. The first thing ever written down in this country that we can still read is a man reminding another man that he owes him money. Beyond the great port there were perhaps 20 substantial towns, the tribal capitals, each laid out on a grid, each with a forum, a basilica, public baths, temples, often an amphitheatre or a theatre, and eventually a wall. In the bathing town in the west there was something unique in the empire's north, a hot spring that comes out of the ground at a steady heat, 250,000 gallons a day, orange with iron, steaming in the winter air. The Britons had worshipped a goddess there. The Romans built over her a temple and an enormous lead-lined bath and a suite of heated rooms, kept her name joined to their own goddess of wisdom, and turned the place into a spa that drew people from across the province and from Gaul. And into the sacred spring over 3 centuries visitors threw their prayers, more than 100 small sheets of lead and pewter, scratched with messages, sometimes written backwards, sometimes rolled up and pierced with a nail. They are almost all complaints, and they are the most human documents in Roman Britain. Somebody has stolen my bathing tunic, and I ask the goddess that the thief lose their mind and their eyes in the temple. Somebody has taken 6 coins from my purse. Whoever stole my bronze vessel, may they become as liquid as water. A man lists the names of 18 suspects and asks the goddess to sort out which one it was. These are not the prayers of a serene classical civilization. They are the prayers of ordinary irritated people who have had their cloak nicked at the swimming baths and want cosmic vengeance, and they were written by people we would not otherwise know could write at all, which tells us that basic literacy in Roman Britain went further down the social scale than we used to think. Meanwhile, in the countryside, which is where 9 people out of 10 actually lived, the great change of the 2nd and 3rd centuries was the villa. The word conjures a marble palace, and a few were nearly that, but most British villas were working farms whose owners had done well enough to rebuild in stone with some comfort. A modest villa is a row of rooms with a corridor along the front and a wing at each end, plastered and painted inside, glazed windows, a tiled roof, a small bath suite in an outbuilding, and a yard full of barns and threshing floors and byres, because the money came from grain and wool. The land around it was worked by tenants and slaves living in much simpler buildings, some of them still round houses well into the 3rd century. There were perhaps 1,000 villas in Britain by the end, concentrated in the south and the west and the corn-growing east, and virtually none in the north or in Wales, which stayed a country of military zones and native farms. Inside a good villa, life was arranged around underfloor heating and mosaic floors, and both of them tell you something. The heating tells you that these were people who had decided the British climate was a problem to be solved with engineering, and they solved it better than anyone would again here until the 20th century. The mosaics tell you what was in their heads. British mosaic floors, laid by workshops based in particular towns whose styles can be told apart, show the seasons, the winds, hunting scenes, sea creatures, and above all the stories of classical mythology done by craftsmen who had probably never seen the Mediterranean, working from pattern books, in a country where the sea is grey. A farmer in the West Midlands walked every day across a floor, showing a hero fighting a monster. In a room heated by a slave, eating food grown in fields his great-grandfather had ploughed with a wooden ard, and he thought of himself, without any strain at all, as a Roman. Let us take one such family and keep them, because they will carry us through the end of the story. in a valley in the west of the province, on good red soil above a river, there was an estate we will call by its owner's name, and the owner in the middle of the 3rd century was a man called Vitalinus. His family had been there for 200 years. His great-great-grandfather had been a British nobleman with a round house and a herd of cattle and a good marriage. His great-grandfather had built the first rectangular house. 4 rooms, cold, ambitious. His grandfather had added the bath suite and the first mosaic, which was a simple geometric one, and had served on the town council 20 miles away, which was an honour and a financial catastrophe, because a councillor was personally liable for the tax shortfall of his district and was expected to pay for public works out of his own pocket to prove he was worthy. That is the hidden mechanism of the Roman world, and it explains a great deal about how it ended. The empire outsourced its running costs to the vanity of the provincial rich, and it worked wonderfully for 2 centuries, and then the rich noticed the trap and began, quietly, to avoid the honour. Vitalinus was a careful man. He grew wheat for the Northern Army's grain contract, which was a steady buyer at a set price, and he kept sheep for the cloth trade, and he had a pottery kiln on the estate and a small mill on the stream. He had 4 children and buried 2. He could read and write and did both slowly. He wore a heavy wool tunic and a hooded cape in winter, and his wife wore a long gown pinned at the shoulders and a shawl and, on good days, jet beads from the northern coast, which were fashionable that decade. They ate off the local grey pottery every day and the imported red pottery when they had guests, and they drank imported wine at midwinter and beer the rest of the year. And in the corner of the dining room there was a little shrine with a few bronze figures in it, and one of the figures was a Roman god and one was a British one, and they did not think that odd at all. Let us slow right down now and spend a while simply living in that villa year, because the shape of the year is the shape of the life, and there is nothing in it that needs to keep you awake. The year began in the dark. Midwinter and the great festival that ran for days, when the household rules were turned upside down, when slaves were served by their owners at least in gesture, when everybody gave small gifts of wax candles and pottery figures and honey cakes, and nobody worked. It was the one point in the calendar when the whole empire, from the Syrian desert to the wall, was doing roughly the same thing on the same night, and in Britain it fell in the deepest gloom of the year, when the sun rose late over the wet hill and set again in the middle of the afternoon. Then the slow climb out. In late winter the ploughing began where the soil allowed, with a wooden ard drawn by a yoke of oxen, breaking the ground in 2 directions because the ard scratches rather than turns, though by this period a heavier plough with an iron share and sometimes a coulter was coming into use on the heavier soils, and that is a quiet technological revolution of its own, because a plough that turns a furrow lets you farm clay, and the clay lands of Britain are the rich ones, spring, and the sowing of the summer crops, and the lambing, which meant nights in the fold with a horn lantern, and the first grass, and the cattle let out of the byres where they had stood all winter eating hay while their manure was carefully saved, because manure was the only fertilizer there was, and estates argued over it. Early summer, and the shearing and the hay, and hay is the great forgotten labour of pre-modern farming, because everything depends on how much winter fodder you can cut and dry in a fortnight of decent weather, and in Britain a fortnight of decent weather is not a promise. Then the long wait while the grain filled, and the weeding by hand, and then, in the late summer, the harvest, which took every hand on the estate, and hired hands besides, cutting with a sickle low or high depending on whether the straw was wanted, binding, stooking, carting, and finally threshing on a hard floor with flails, and winnowing in the doorway where the draught blows the chaff away. The grain went into a granary raised on staddles, or on a low wall, so the air could move under it, because damp grain heats and rots, and in Britain damp grain is the constant enemy. Then autumn, the pigs into the oak woods for the acorns, the killing of the animals that could not be overwintered, the salting and smoking, the pressing of apples, the last ploughing, and the dark coming down again. That is the wheel, and it turned in exactly that way in this island for something like 3,000 years, and the Romans did not change it. They changed what you could buy with the surplus. Inside the house, the days were shaped by daylight, because artificial light was expensive. A pottery lamp burning olive oil gives about as much light as a single candle, and olive oil had to come from Spain. Tallow candles smelled. Rushlights, made by peeling a rush down to the pith and drawing it through hot fat, gave perhaps 20 minutes of light each, and were what ordinary people actually used. So the household got up at first light and went to bed not long after dark for most of the year, and slept, in all likelihood in 2 shifts, with a waking hour in the middle of the night, which is what people did everywhere before cheap lighting. If you have ever woken at 3 in the morning and lain there calmly, that may be an old rhythm, older than Rome, coming back. Clothing was wool and linen, and everything was made by hand from the sheep's back upward. Spinning was constant, done by women and girls with a distaff and a drop spindle, standing, walking, talking, watching the pot, and a woman with a spindle in her hand was the ordinary sight of the ancient world. To clothe one household in 1 year takes an astonishing number of hours, tens of thousands of them, and that is why cloth was valuable, and why clothes were repaired, handed down, and left in wills. The Romans introduced the 2-beam upright loom, and then the improved weighted loom, and the loom weights, little pierced clay triangles, are one of the commonest finds on any British site. Fine wool was dyed with madder for red, weld for yellow, wode for blue, and lichens for purples. And the very rich had cloth dyed with real shellfish purple from the Mediterranean, at a price per pound that would buy a farm. Personal appearance mattered enormously and changed with fashion in a way we can date. The men of the 1st century were clean-shaven, then the Emperor Hadrian grew a beard and the entire empire grew a beard for 100 years, and you can date a sculpture in Britain by the chin on it. Women's hair went through periods of alarming complexity, piled and pinned and curled with heated iron rods, and there were hairpins by the 1,000 in bone and bronze and jet. There were tweezers, ear scoops, nail cleaners, often on a little ring together like a modern key ring, and they are found in every town. There were mirrors of polished bronze and later of glass backed with lead. There were cosmetics, and one extraordinary find from the port town on the Thames is a small sealed tin canister still containing its cream, a white fatty paste of animal fat, starch and tin oxide, with the finger marks of the last person who used it still in the surface. Somebody dipped 2 fingers into that pot and put the lid on and never came back. 1,700 years ago, and there are her fingerprints. Health was a matter of luck, and of what your body had already survived. The commonest complaints in the skeletal record are exactly what you would expect from a life of physical labour and coarse food. Arthritis in the spine and the knees beginning young, teeth worn flat by the grit from the quernstones, because grinding grain between stones put stone dust in the flour, and by middle-aged teeth were often ground down to the pulp. Surprisingly little tooth decay, because there was almost no sugar, so people had worn teeth rather than rotten ones. Broken bones, well set mostly, signs of childhood hunger written in the enamel of the teeth as faint lines, each line a season when the food ran short. And in the towns, the diseases that come from crowding and bad water, which is why the Romans were so obsessed with aqueducts and drains, and their obsession was correct even though their explanation for it was wrong. Doctors existed and had instruments of real sophistication, sets of bronze probes and scalpels and forceps that would not look out of place a century ago. And there were oculists who made stamps to mark their blocks of eye ointment, and several such stamps have been found in Britain. There was also a very great deal of religion in medicine, which is not a criticism, because when you cannot cure something, ritual is what you have. People wore amulets, people made models of the afflicted part, an arm, an eye, a breast, in bronze or in clay, and left them at temples, and the temples of the healing springs are full of them. As for children, they were loved exactly as much as children are always loved, and the evidence for that is not sentiment but tombstones, and Britain has plenty, and the wording on them is unbearable in the same way it would be now. A father records a daughter of 3 years, 7 months and 11 days. A couple record a son, sweetest, most dutiful. The formula is standard, and the grief inside the formula is not. And education, for those who could pay for it, was a matter of a hired teacher or a local school, learning letters by copying, learning to count on an abacus and on the fingers, and for the ambitious, learning the great poets by heart. We have a fragment of a wax tablet from the port town, on which a line from the greatest of the Latin poems has been written out carefully, and underneath the same line copied badly by a child's hand, and that is a homework exercise, and it survived because the tablet went into the river. Now think about movement. Because a province is held together by the ability to go somewhere, there were perhaps 10,000 miles of made road in Roman Britain, and the network is astonishingly complete. From the port on the Thames, roads radiated like the spokes of a wheel, west to the bathing town and beyond, northwest along the Great Road to the legionary fortress in the West Midlands and on into Wales, north along the road that ran to the northern capital and then to the Wall, northeast to the flat country, southeast to the Channel ports. Every road had milestones, stone cylinders about the height of a person, giving the distance to the next town and the name and titles of the emperor who had paid for the repair, and 100 or so survive in Britain. On the main routes there was the imperial post, a relay system reserved for government business, with a change of horses roughly every 8 to 10 miles and a proper staging inn every 25 or 30, where an official traveller with a warrant could get a bed, a meal, fresh animals, and a wheelwright. Those inns were courtyard buildings, sometimes very large, with stables around a yard and rooms above and a bath suite attached. And if you have ever stayed in an old coaching inn, you have stayed in the same building type, unchanged in plan for 2,000 years. A private traveller could not use the post, and travelled at the speed of the cart or of their own feet. Say 20 miles a day on foot in good weather, less with a load, perhaps 30 on a horse if you did not mind the horse. A journey from the south coast to the Wall was a fortnight. It was also, by the standards of most of history, extremely safe, and that safety was the empire's greatest and least visible product. For most of 4 centuries, a merchant could load a cart with goods and drive it from the Channel to the northern frontier and reasonably expect to arrive. There were bandits in the wilder parts, and there were periods when it went bad, but the everyday condition was that the roads worked and the courts worked, and a contract could be enforced. When people afterwards remembered Rome with longing, this is mostly what they were remembering, without being able to name it. On those roads moved the industry of Britain, and Britain was an industrial province in a way that surprises people. Lead above all. The ore fields in the western hills, in the Pennines, in the flatlands of the northwest, and in the far southwest, were producing within 6 years of the invasion, which is astonishingly fast, and tells you the invasion had a shopping list. Lead came out in heavy rectangular ingots stamped with the emperor's name, and sometimes with the word meaning British, and British lead has been found as far away as the coast of Gaul, and in the plumbing of the great city itself. And in the lead was silver, extracted by heating the metal in a shallow hearth and blowing air across it, so that the lead oxidized away and left the silver behind. A process that leaves a distinctive slag which archaeologists find in heaps. Iron came out of the forest in the southeast, and the belt of ore in the Midlands, worked in bloomery furnaces, small clay chimneys packed with charcoal and ore, blown by bellows for hours, producing a spongy lump of iron that then had to be hammered again and again to drive out the slag. It is desperately hard work, and it consumed forests. There was tin in the far southwest, which had been traded to the Mediterranean since long before Rome, and became important again late in the Roman period when pewter, an alloy of tin and lead, became the tableware of the middling sort. There was salt, boiled out of seawater and out of brine springs in enormous quantities in coastal saltings and in the West Midlands, and salt is not a luxury. It is the technology that lets you keep meat through a winter, and the salt industry underwrote everything else. There was pottery, and here we can watch a British industry grow up and go global within its own world. In the 1st century, the fine tableware all came from Gaul. By the 2nd century, British potteries in the East Midlands and the New Forest and the Nene Valley were making very good wares of their own. and by the 3rd and 4th centuries one great potting region in the south, producing sturdy grey and black cooking pots, had captured the market of the entire province, from the channel to the wall, and its pots were being shipped hundreds of miles by sea and road, and they turn up in the northern forts by the thousand. That is a mass market with regional specialisation and long-distance distribution, in Britain in the 3rd century. And there was wool, and the cloth from it, the heavy-hooded capes and the rugs, listed in an imperial price edict as goods of quality worth naming, and there were the exports nobody likes to list. British hunting dogs were famous and went abroad by the shipload. And people, slaves were a British export before the conquest, and remained a commodity through it. Now let us also be honest about the shape of it all, because there is a temptation to describe Roman Britain as if it were a modern country with worse plumbing. It was not. It was extremely unequal, extremely local, and extremely thin. The province had at its peak perhaps 3.5 million people, and of those maybe 1 in 10 lived in anything you could call a town. There was no such thing as public education, public health, or public relief, except that the state cared very much about the grain supply to its own soldiers. Most people never travelled more than a day from where they were born. Most people could not read, though more could than we used to think. The law was two-tiered, with better people and humbler people formally distinguished in what punishments could be applied to them, and a humbler person could be beaten, tortured for evidence, or condemned to the mines for things that would cost a better person a fine. And over the whole thing lay the tax demand, in grain and in coin, arriving every year, indifferent to the harvest. But set against that, this is what the Roman century in Britain actually delivered, and it is not nothing. A person born in a British farmstead in the year 150 could expect, if they were lucky, a life without war in their own country. They could buy manufactured goods cheaply, they could travel safely, they could go to a hot bath, they could take a dispute to a court that would probably hear it. They could see, if they went to a town, buildings of a scale their ancestors could not have imagined and their descendants would not see again for 1,000 years. And the whole of that depended, invisibly, on a machine that was running somewhere else, in Rome, in the treasury, in the mints, in the frontier armies, and nobody in Britain thought about it any more than we think about the electricity grid. That is the thing to hold on to as our story turns towards its ending. Not that Rome fell, that a machine which had been running quietly in the background for 400 years stopped. And when it stopped, everything that had been standing on it came down, slowly, over about 2 generations, in the manner of a house whose foundations are removed one course at a time. And what did people do when they were not working? That question is nearly always left out of histories, and it should not be, because leisure tells you more about a society than its constitution does. Start with a calendar, because the Roman year was extraordinarily full of days off. The official festival calendar of the city had well over 100 days on which public business was suspended. And while a British farm did not stop for a Roman festival, a British town certainly did. There were the great fixed points. The New Year in January, with gifts of dates and figs and honey and small coins, and a general effort to begin the year in a good temper, because the way you began it was thought to set the tone of the whole. There was the spring festival of the flower goddess, with garlands. There was the midsummer and the harvest festivals, and the extraordinary week of midwinter when the world turned upside down. There were the days of the dead in spring, and again in the autumn, when families went out to the cemetery with food and ate a meal at the grave, and poured wine into a pipe let into the ground so that the dead could drink with them. That last practice is not metaphorical. There are graves in Britain fitted with lead or pottery tubes running from the surface down to the burial, so that the living could pour a share of the feast to the person below. There are also the days of the local gods, and the days of the emperor, and the days of a particular temple's dedication, and if you lived in a town you would rarely go 3 weeks without something. Then the shows. Britain had amphitheatres, and more of them than people expect. The Great Port had one for several thousand. The legionary fortresses each had one just outside the walls, and the one in the west of the country is a beautiful oval bowl of turf-covered stone banks, with the entrance tunnels still standing. Several of the tribal capitals had them, and what happened in them was a mixture of things, some of which we would recognise as sport, and some of which we would not attend. There were gladiators in Britain, unquestionably. There is a glass cup, made in the Rhineland, found in a grave here, with the names of gladiators moulded into it as decoration, the way a modern souvenir tumbler might carry the names of footballers. There is a pottery vessel from the port, showing a fight in progress with the referee. There is a knife handle in the shape of a gladiator. Whether the great professional troops ever came this far north is doubtful and expensive. What is likely is that most British amphitheatre days were more modest, with beast shows, staged hunts, exhibitions, executions of criminals, and public assemblies. Because an amphitheatre was also simply the largest available room in town and got used for anything that needed a crowd. There were theatres too, proper semicircular ones with a stage building, at the town north of the port and elsewhere, and the drama of the Roman world by this period was mostly not the classical tragedy of the schoolbooks, but pantomime and farce. A single masked dancer performing a whole story with a chorus and a musician, or knockabout comedy with stock characters, which is to say that the popular entertainment of Roman Britain was closer to a pantomime at Christmas than to anything solemn. There was chariot racing somewhere, though we have not found a circus in Britain for certain, and there is a very tantalising piece of evidence, a curse tablet and some pottery showing racing scenes, and above all the fact that Britons had been mad for horses and chariots since long before Rome arrived. It is genuinely likely that racing happened here on temporary tracks, and that the four great racing colours had their supporters in these towns as they did everywhere else in the empire. Then the ordinary daily leisure, which is the part we can prove best of all, because it leaves rubbish. People gambled constantly. Dice are one of the commonest small finds on Roman sites in Britain, in bone and in stone, and some of them are loaded, weighted on one side with a plug of lead, which is a marvellous thing to hold in your hand 1700 years later. There are gaming boards scratched into paving stones and onto the tops of walls at forts, in the exact way that bored people have always scratched a board into whatever is flat. And there are the counters, made from broken pottery ground into neat discs by somebody with time to fill. The games were a race game with dice, and a game of capture played with black and white counters that was popular with soldiers, and there is a passage in a Roman writer joking about a man who plays it so seriously that his household lives in fear. People drank. Every town had taverns, and every fort village had several, and the drinking vessels are everywhere, and there was beer of several qualities, including a superior sort that appears by name in an account from the northern frontier, and imported wine for those who could pay. People bathed and gossiped, and the baths were where the town's news moved. People went to dinner, and Roman dinner in the provinces was a real ceremony among the well-off, taken reclining on couches in the proper style in the good rooms of the villas, with courses, and imported delicacies, and a great deal of conversation, and the whole architecture of the dining room, with its mosaic laid so that the pattern reads correctly from the couches, is designed around that. People kept pets, and there is a tile from a British kiln on which a cat walked across the wet clay before firing and left 4 perfect prints, and another on which a dog did the same, and another where a small child's foot came down in the corner. Somebody that day must have been extremely annoyed. Those tiles went into the kiln anyway, and into a roof, and now they are in a case. Music we know least about, which is a pity. There are pipes and fragments of stringed instruments and small bronze bells and rattles and a set of bone flutes. And there was certainly singing, and the British had a strong bardic tradition of their own that the Romans noticed and did not much record. But when you imagine the fort village on a winter evening, put music in it, because there was music in it. There was also the thing that most reliably filled ancient leisure hours, which was talk. Long, unhurried, repetitive talk. In a world without printing, without clocks, and without light after dark, an evening is a very long thing, and the ordinary way to spend it was in a warm room with people you had known your whole life, telling the same stories again. It is worth remembering that the greatest works of ancient literature were composed to be spoken aloud to people sitting like that, and that most people in Roman Britain who encountered a poem encountered it as somebody's voice and never saw a written word of it. Which is, if you think about it, exactly the arrangement you and I have tonight. Somebody speaking. Somebody listening in a warm room in the dark. That part has not changed in 2,000 years, and will not change in 2,000 more. The 3rd century opens with an emperor at the northern edge of the world again. He was an African, born in what is now Libya, a hard practical soldier who had taken the throne in a civil war, and he came to Britain as an old man with gout, with his empress and his 2 quarrelling sons, and he came because the north had gone bad, and because he wanted his boys out of the city and doing something. He rebuilt the wall so thoroughly that for centuries antiquarians thought he had built it in the first place. He drove 2 enormous campaigns into the far north, and the marching camps of those campaigns can still be traced from the air as faint rectangles in the barley, some of them big enough for 40,000 men. He built a colossal supply base on the eastern coast, converting an entire fort into granaries, which is the surest sign of intent there is. And then he fell ill at the northern capital and died there, in his bed, in a British winter, and his sons made peace immediately. Went home, and one of them murdered the other within the year. Rome never seriously tried to take the north again. But the old emperor did one thing that lasted. He split the province in 2 into an upper and a lower Britain, each with its own governor, so that no single man in Britain would ever again command 3 legions and be tempted to use them. It is the beginning of a long process of subdividing, and by the 4th century Britain would be 4 provinces, then 5, inside a larger diocese, with a civil administration on one side and a military one on the other, and more officials by far than the province had ever had before. Then came the crisis. For about 50 years in the middle of the 3rd century, the empire nearly came apart. Emperors were made and killed by their own troops at a rate of 1 every 2 or 3 years. There was plague. There was invasion on the Rhine and the Danube and in the east. And there was money. This is the part that matters most for Britain, and it is the least dramatic. The silver coin that the whole empire ran on had been quietly debased for generations, a little more copper each time, until by the middle of the century it contained almost no silver at all, and everybody knew it. Prices went up by factors that are hard to compute, but were certainly enormous. Trade did not stop, but it changed shape, becoming more local, more in kind, more suspicious. People buried their money in the ground in quantities that make the 3rd century the golden age of British coin hoards, and a buried hoard is a message that says 2 things at once, that somebody had savings and that somebody did not come back for them. Britain came through this better than most of the empire, partly because it was an island, and partly because it was a long way from the frontiers that were burning. In fact, the province was for a while a refuge, and there is a real sense that the British villa economy was doing well precisely when Gaul was suffering, because when the continental estates were raided their markets shifted here. Then Britain did something extraordinary that most people have never heard of. It became an independent country for 10 years. The man who did it commanded the Channel Fleet, based at the port on the northern coast of Gaul, with a brief to suppress the sea raiders who were beginning to come across the North Sea in numbers. He was accused, probably rightly, of letting the raiders take their plunder and then intercepting them on the way home and keeping the proceeds. When an order came for his arrest, he did the obvious thing. He took the fleet, took Britain, declared himself emperor, and dared the central government to come and get him. And for a while they could not, because they had no fleet, and he had all of it. So for nearly a decade there was a separate British Empire, with its own mints producing coins of better silver than the central government's, coins carrying slogans about restoration and about the awaited one, coins with lines of poetry on them, addressed to a British audience and telling that audience that it had its own emperor now and its own peace. It ended the way these things end. He was murdered by his own finance minister, who ruled for 3 more years, and then the central government finally built a fleet, crossed in fog, landed west of the Isle of Wight, and destroyed him. The victorious emperor's colleague came to the port on the Thames and was greeted, according to a gold medallion struck to commemorate it, as the restorer of the eternal light, with a kneeling figure representing the city welcoming him at the gate. That medallion was found in a field in northern France, and it shows us the walls and the river of Roman London as somebody actually saw them. Out of that crisis came a hard new empire and a hard new Britain. The frontier of the province was no longer only in the north, it was now the sea. Along the south and east coasts, on every estuary and harbour, a chain of enormous new forts went up, quite unlike the neat playing card forts of the old army. These were castles. Walls 12 or 14 feet thick and 30 feet high, with projecting round bastions for artillery, 1 or 2 gates, and very little inside except space. They face the sea. They were built against raiders coming out of the North German coast and the mouths of the Rhine and the Elbe. People the Romans called by a name that would eventually be the name of half of England. And you can still walk into several of them today, and the walls are standing to nearly their full height, with the horizontal courses of red tile running through the flint like the layers in a cake, and grass inside where the barracks were, and the sea a mile off because the coastline has moved. The towns changed too. In the 2nd century, a British town had had a wall as a matter of civic pride, an elegant thing with decorative gates. In the late 3rd and 4th centuries, those walls were thickened, the gates narrowed, the outer ditches deepened and doubled, and projecting towers were added to carry catapults, and the towers were often built out of tombstones and broken statues taken from the cemeteries outside, because there was no time to quarry. That is a detail worth pausing on. Somewhere in the late Roman period, in town after town, somebody made the decision to pull down the monuments of their own grandparents and put them in a wall. Necessity had arrived. And yet, and this is the strange twist that makes late Roman Britain so interesting, the century that followed all this was the richest the province ever had. The 4th century in Britain is the age of the great villas. Not the modest 4-room farmhouses of before, but sprawling courtyard palaces with 40 and 50 rooms, with heated dining suites, with private bathhouses of real elaboration, with mosaic floors of a quality that had not been seen here before and would not be seen again. In the West Country, in the Cotswold valleys, in the chalk downs, in the rich soils of the south, the villa owners of the 4th century built as if the world were going to last forever. Nobody is entirely sure why. Perhaps because Britain had been spared the worst of the 3rd century wreckage and had capital when others did not. Perhaps because rich families from Gaul moved their money and themselves across the water when the Rhine frontier got frightening. Perhaps because the new imperial system taxed in grain, and Britain grew grain, so British landowners had exactly the commodity the state most wanted, and could name their terms. Whatever the cause, the effect is unmistakable in the ground. This province, on the outer edge of everything, spent the 4th century laying floors. Let us go back to that valley in the west, to the estate we left in the 3rd century, and see it 100 years on, because the family is still there. Vitellinus is 4 generations dead. The house he knew is buried under the house that stands now, which has a colonnaded front, 2 wings enclosing a courtyard, and a separate range for the farm across a second yard. Inside, the reception room has a floor showing the 4 seasons in the corners, each a woman's head with a wreath appropriate to her time of year, and in the centre a scene from the old stories, laid in tesserae the size of your fingernail, in 9 or 10 shades made from local limestone and red tile, and black shale and white chalk. The dining room next door is heated under the floor, and the flue tiles in the walls are stamped by the maker. The window glass is greenish and slightly wavy, but it is glass, in wooden frames, and it lets in light and keeps out the weather, and there is nothing else like that anywhere in the world at that latitude. The family who live here are called by good Roman names, and they are Britons to the bone, and they run an estate of perhaps 1,000 acres with tenants and slaves, and their money comes from wheat and wool, and from a share in a pottery, and from lending at interest. The head of the household in the middle of the 4th century we will call Paternus, and his wife Corotica, whose name is British, and whose grandmother was a very rich woman from the eastern side of the province. They have 5 children, of whom 3 live. They own silver. That is worth dwelling on, because late Roman Britain has given up the most spectacular hoards of Roman silver ever found anywhere, and they were found in ordinary British fields. Great dishes 2 feet across, worked with scenes of the sea god and dancing figures, wine strainers, spoons with Christian symbols, pepper pots shaped like a fashionable lady's bust, with a mechanism underneath to control the flow, bowls, ladles, flasks and jewellery of gold set, with garnets and glass. One hoard weighed nearly 80 pounds of precious metal. Another contained 15,000 coins alongside the plate. These were the table services of the 4th century British rich, and they show a level of luxury that is genuinely startling on the edge of the known world. And they were all buried. Every one of them. That is the other half of the sentence. Somebody wrapped that silver in cloth, put it in a box or a pot, dug a hole in a field or under a floor, and never came back. And into this comfortable world, in that same century, came a new religion in an official way. The great persecution had run through the empire at the start of the century, and Britain had its martyrs, or at least one whose story stuck, a citizen of the town on the road north of the port who sheltered a fugitive priest, exchanged clothes with him, was taken in his place, and was executed on a hill above the river, and a shrine grew on the hill, and a town grew around the shrine, and it carries his name today. Within a decade of that persecution, the empire changed its mind entirely, and Christianity went from illegal to favoured to official in the space of 2 generations. British bishops attended a church council in Gaul very early in the process, 3 of them, from the port on the Thames, from the northern capital, and from a 3rd city, and they were poor enough that the record notes they had to use the imperial post to get there. So there were organised Christian communities in British cities by then, with a hierarchy and enough structure to send delegates. In the countryside it went more slowly and more strangely. Britain has produced a mosaic floor from a villa with the face of Christ on it, one of the earliest anywhere, with the sacred monogram behind his head, and in the corners of the very same floor are figures from pagan myth, and along the border are hunting scenes. Whoever commissioned that floor saw no difficulty at all. There is a house with a painted room that seems to have been a private chapel, with figures standing in prayer with their arms out, and at the same time, the old temples of the countryside were not abandoned. Some of the largest and most elaborate rural temple complexes in Britain were built or rebuilt in the 4th century, well after the empire had turned Christian, and one great temple to a hunter god in the west was constructed in this late period with a guest house, a bath suite, and a long hall for pilgrims to sleep in overnight in the hope of a healing dream, and there they left, among other things, small votive models of hunting dogs. So the picture is not a religion replacing a religion. It is a country where the new faith held the cities and the officials and the tax-paying classes and a good number of the villa owners, and where the old gods held the fields and the springs and the crossroads, and where a great many people, quite sensibly, kept a foot in both. Corotica had a silver spoon with a Christian symbol on the handle, and also, in a niche by the kitchen door, a small crude figure of a native mother goddess with 3 hooded figures beside her, and she would not have been able to explain the contradiction, and would not have felt one. The towns, meanwhile, were changing in a way that is often described as decline, and is better described as transformation. The grand public buildings were falling out of use. The great basilica in the port on the Thames was demolished around the start of the 4th century. Forums elsewhere became markets or workshops, and there are late Roman towns where the forum courtyard is full of small industrial hearths and butchery waste. Public baths closed or shrank. But the town walls were maintained, and grand private houses continued to be built inside the walls, with mosaics of their own, and the population did not vanish. What had gone was the class of men willing to pay for public magnificence, and they had gone for a reason we have already met. Serving on a town council had become a hereditary financial trap, and the imperial government of the 4th century had to pass laws forbidding councillors from escaping into the church, into the army, or into the imperial civil service, which tells you exactly where they were all escaping to. The rich now spent their money on their own houses in the country and their own silver on their own tables, and the town square went quiet. That is not a barbarian invasion. That is a change in what wealth is for, and it happened over a century, and nobody in any given year would have said that anything was ending. Paternus, walking through the town at the age of 50, would have seen a place still busy with markets and workshops and churches and courts, with a wall in good repair and a garrison of sorts, with the grand old public hall of his great-grandfather's day standing empty at one end, with weeds in the steps. And he would have thought, as we all think about the ruins in our own cities, that they built extravagantly in those days, and that things were more sensible now. Now let us look under that 4th century splendour, because a golden age is always a view from a particular window, and we should walk round to the other side of the house. The late Roman state was a far heavier thing than the early one. The early empire had been astonishingly light, a few hundred officials for 50 million people, running on local elites who paid for the privilege of being important. The late empire, remade after the crisis, had a vast civil service, a doubled army, a court with elaborate ceremony, and a tax system designed by men who had watched money die and had decided never to depend on it again. So the great tax was now assessed in kind, on land and on labour together, reassessed periodically, and collected in grain, and in animals, and in cloth, and in recruits. That is a heavy machine to sit on top of a farming society, because grain taken is grain that cannot be sown, and a recruit taken is a pair of hands gone from the harvest. And once the state is taking a fixed quantity in kind, the incentive of every landowner is to be big enough to negotiate, and every small farmer's incentive is to attach himself to somebody big enough to negotiate for him, which is exactly what happened all over the Western Empire, including here. The small independent farm shrank as a category. The great estate grew. And the tenant who worked a piece of somebody else's land in exchange for a share of the crop found over the course of the 4th century, that the law was changing around him. A series of imperial laws tied tenants to the estate they were registered on, because the tax was assessed on land plus the people who worked it, and a tenant who moved took the revenue with him. So he could not move. He was not a slave. He could not be sold on his own. He had legal personality. He could marry and hold property, but he could not leave. And his children could not leave. And if he ran away, he could be brought back. That is not a Roman institution, as we usually imagine Rome. That is serfdom, invented for administrative convenience, 300 years before anyone would call it that. We do not know how strictly any of it was enforced in Britain, a long way from the court. But the shape is there in the ground. The 4th century countryside of lowland Britain is a countryside of a few enormous rich houses and a great many small farmsteads that got no richer at all through the whole period, and a village population living in buildings that would not have surprised their ancestors much. Set the pepper pot shaped like a fashionable lady next to a 4th century farm labourer's cottage of one room with a beaten floor, and you have the society. And yet, and here is the honesty that history requires, that ordinary farm labourer in the year 350 was almost certainly living better than his descendants would in the year 450. He had iron tools that were cheap because they were mass-produced. He had a wheel-thrown pot that cost him almost nothing. He had access to a market where he could sell a surplus for coin and buy something he had not made. He had, in most years, peace and roads he could walk safely, and salt he could afford, and if he was very unlucky and very determined, he could take a complaint to a magistrate. When the machine stopped, all of that stopped for him too, and he did not have a villa's worth of buried silver to soften the change. The people who lost most in the fall of Roman Britain were not the villa owners. who kept their land and became lords of a new kind. It was everyone who had been relying on cheap manufactured things and a functioning market, which is to say almost everybody. Now the army of this last century deserves a word too, because it was not the army of the walls building. It had been split into two kinds. There were the frontier troops, the descendants of the old garrisons, living in their forts with their families, farming locally, paid partly in supplies, and regarded by the court as second class. And there were the field armies, the mobile forces, better paid and better equipped, kept back from the frontier and moved to wherever the emergency was, full of recruits drawn from beyond the frontier, from the Germanic peoples, who fought in Roman units under Roman officers and often were the Roman officers. In Britain there was a small field force under a count, a frontier command in the north under a duke, and a coastal command under a count of the Saxon shore, and their titles and units are listed in a late imperial document that is one of the strangest survivals we have, a kind of civil service organisation chart with little pictures of the fortresses beside the entries. It lists the whole military and civil establishment of Britain, unit by unit, office by office. It is a snapshot of a bureaucracy at the moment before it evaporated, and reading it is like finding a company directory in the ruins of an office building. The soldiers of this army did not look like the soldiers of the invasion. Gone was the curved rectangular shield, and the short stabbing sword, and the segmented armour of the picture books. The late Roman soldier carried a large oval shield painted with his unit's device, a long slashing sword, a spear, throwing darts clipped inside the shield, and he wore a mail shirt and a ridge helmet made in two halves joined by a strip along the crown, and a long-sleeved tunic and trousers, and a heavy military belt with elaborate fittings that were the badge of his status. Those belt fittings are the diagnostic find of the period. They turn up in graves across Britain, and in some of those graves the buckle is Roman official issue and the burial rite is not, which is the whole late empire in one hole in the ground. And the officers increasingly had names that were not Latin, and prayed in ways that were not Roman, and served an empire that was formally Christian and functionally a patronage network, and did their jobs perfectly well. That was the arrangement holding Britain together in the last decades. It was not decadent, it was not exhausted, and the people in it were not sleepwalking. They were competent professionals managing a difficult province with resources that were being cut every year by a court dealing with worse problems elsewhere, and one year the last transfer did not arrive, and there was nothing any of them could have done about it. 324 years after the ships came ashore in Kent, the province had its worst year. It was called afterwards the conspiracy, and the word is the right one, because what happened was not a single invasion, but a coordinated collapse of the frontier on several sides at once. The tribes beyond the wall came south. Raiders from Ireland came into the west. Sea raiders from across the North Sea came into the east and the south. The commander of the coastal defences was killed. The commander of the field army in Britain was ambushed and cut off. And, most tellingly of all, a body of frontier scouts whose job was to patrol north of the wall and report were found to have been taking bribes to say nothing. Britain, for something like a year, had no functioning government. Bands of raiders roamed as far inland as the outskirts of the port on the Thames, and the roads were unsafe, and deserters and runaway slaves joined the raiders because a disordered country always produces its own bandits from within. Then the machine reasserted itself, one more time, and did it beautifully. A senior general was sent from the continent with 4 regiments of the field army. He landed in Kent, marched up the road, met scattered bands laden with plunder and slow with it, and destroyed them one by one. He offered an amnesty to deserters, which brought in a surprising number. He entered the capital in triumph. He then spent 2 years restoring the frontier, rebuilding the town's defences, replacing the corrupt scout service with something else, and reorganising the whole military command, and Britain went on. But something in the province did not recover, and you can see it in the ground. The little villages outside the northern forts, the ones full of shops and workshops and families, were largely abandoned after this. From now on, the garrison lived inside the walls, with its dependents, in a way that looks much more like a medieval castle than a Roman fort, and the Northern Army stopped being an army in the old sense. The men were now paid partly in kind, they held land locally, they were increasingly the sons of the previous garrison, and their units, which on paper still had the proud old names of Spanish and Batavian and Thracian regiments, were in fact hereditary local militias of British-born men who had never left the valley. That was probably a reasonable adaptation. It was also a one-way door, because a hereditary local militia cannot be moved and cannot be replaced, and does not need much money, and so, when the money stops, it does not immediately notice, and then one day it stops being soldiers and simply becomes the people who live in the fort. The next blow was self-inflicted, and it is the pattern that finally kills Roman Britain. In the year 383, the commander in Britain, a Spaniard by birth with a British wife and a great deal of ambition, was proclaimed emperor by his own troops, and he took a large part of the British garrison across the Channel to make good the claim. He won for a while. He ruled the western provinces from Trier for 5 years, and then he pushed too far into Italy and was defeated and killed, and his army did not come back. The men he took to Gaul are simply gone from the record. Welsh legend remembered him for 1,000 years afterwards as a dream emperor who married a British princess, and the memory is a fair one because he was the first of the men who used Britain as a springboard and left it lighter. It happened again a decade later, and again after that. Every time an ambitious commander in Britain reached for the purple, he took soldiers out of the island and did not send them home. Meanwhile, the strategic picture on the continent had gone from difficult to impossible. In the winter at the very end of the 4th century, a great mass of peoples crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul and never left. The land route from Britain to Italy was cut. The Rhine army, which was the reserve behind the British garrison, ceased to exist as such, and the treasury, which had been paying for Britain out of taxation, collected in a system that assumed a functioning continent, began to run dry. Now here is the single most eloquent fact in the whole of this ending, and it is not a battle. It is a coin. Roman Britain used enormous quantities of imperial coinage. Every archaeological site in the province can be dated by the coins in it, because there is a steady stream of new issues arriving year after year for 3.5 centuries, and the mint stamped the mint mark on them so we know where each shipment came from. And then, at the beginning of the 5th century, the stream stops. Coins of the issues struck in the first years of the century reach Britain in reasonable numbers. Coins of the issues after about 402 arrive in tiny quantities, and then in almost none at all. That is the sound of the machine switching off, not an army defeated, a payroll cancelled. Because the coin that arrived in Britain arrived overwhelmingly for one reason: to pay the soldiers and the officials, and once it was in their hands it spread out into the province and became the money everybody used to buy bread and pots and beer. When the shipments ceased, the soldiers stopped being paid in cash, and then the market economy that had been built on that cash began to lose its blood. Nobody legislated it. It simply thinned. 2 more usurpers rose in Britain in quick succession in the space of a year. The last of them a common soldier who was raised up because his name was the same as that of the great emperor of a century before, and who took what remained of the mobile troops in Britain across to Gaul to fight for the empire, or for himself, or for both. He too did not come back. So by about the year 409, Britain had no field army, an unpaid frontier garrison that had turned into a set of local communities, no supply of new coin, no functioning link to the imperial court, and raiders coming in from 3 directions. And the province did the only thing that was left. According to the one Greek historian who mentions it, the Britons took up arms on their own behalf, freed their cities from the barbarians who were threatening them, expelled the imperial officials, and set up their own government. Read that again slowly, because it is not what people expect. Rome did not leave Britain in a column of ships with the eagles going aboard while the natives wept on the shore. Britain expelled Rome's administrators. It was a tax revolt as much as anything, a decision by the people who were left holding the province that if the empire could not defend them, it could not tax them either. And the following year, in 410, the emperor at Ravenna, with the Goths in Italy and his own capital under threat, is said to have replied to a request from the cities of Britain by telling them to look to their own defences. One sentence, in a Greek historian, possibly referring to somewhere else entirely, and it has carried the whole weight of the end of Roman Britain for 1,500 years. That is how the greatest political fact in this island's ancient history is recorded. As an administrative note, as a shrug. So what did it actually feel like to be alive in Britain in the years when it stopped? This is where the story becomes quiet, and where I think it becomes most worth telling. Because the ending of Roman Britain is not a catastrophe you could photograph. It is a slow subtraction, and it happened to people who were mostly getting on with the harvest. The first thing to go was the money, and money going is a strange kind of disaster because nothing visibly breaks. The coins already in circulation kept circulating, worn thinner and thinner, and people clipped the silver ones down to slivers to make the metal go further, and copies were struck locally, crude little imitations that get cruder as the years pass. And eventually people simply stopped using coin at all. Within perhaps 20 or 30 years of the last shipments, coinage as a medium of everyday exchange had ceased in Britain, and it would not properly return for 200 years. Think about what that means for daily life. It does not mean people starved. It means that if you were a potter who had been selling pots for coin to people 50 miles away through a network of traders, your business now had nothing to run on, and you went back to farming. And that is precisely what the archaeology shows. The great pottery industries of Roman Britain, which had been turning out standardized wares by the shipload and distributing them across the whole province, stopped. Not gradually. In archaeological terms, abruptly. The kilns went cold in the first decades of the 5th century, and the skill of the fast wheel and the big updraught kiln vanished from most of Britain so completely that for the next 2 centuries, people in eastern England used pots that were made by hand, without a wheel, and fired in a bonfire. And they were worse than anything the Britons had been making 400 years before the Romans arrived. That is the single starkest fact of the whole collapse. Not that the villas fell down, but that ordinary people lost the ability to make a decent cooking pot, because the ability had been held not by individuals, but by an economy, and the economy had gone. The same happened to everything that depended on scale. Nobody quarried building stone. Nobody made mortar in quantity, because good lime mortar means burning limestone in a kiln, which needs fuel, organisation, and a market. Nobody made window glass. Nobody cast large bronze. Nobody made the iron nails that a Roman building consumed by the barrel. Within 2 generations, the technology of masonry construction was effectively gone from Britain, and people built, once again in timber, thatch and earth, and they built well, because those are good materials, but nothing they built was made to stand for 1,000 years. The villas ended in a way that is oddly moving. There is no burning at most of them, no massacre layer, no sign at all of violence. What you find is this: the mosaic floor of a grand reception room, and standing on the mosaic, a corn drying oven, built out of broken roof tiles, with the burnt grain still in it. The last generation in the house pulled up part of the floor of the best room to install a piece of farm equipment, because a drying kiln indoors is useful, and a picture of the seasons is not. Then a hearth laid straight onto the tesserae, with soot spreading over the border. Then the hypocaust, no longer stoked, filling slowly with silt. Then the roof tiles going, taken away by neighbours for their own use. Then a scatter of post holes cut through the whole thing, showing that somebody put up a timber building inside the shell. Then nothing, and the ivy and the slow rain of 1,000 winters. The estate did not vanish. That is the thing to hold on to. The land went on being farmed, because land is always farmed, and the family who owned it went on being important locally, because the important family usually does. They just stopped living in a Roman way. because being Roman had been a set of imported services, and the imports had stopped. Paternus's great-grandson, whom we will call Canorix, was born around the year 420 in that same valley. He was, on paper, exactly what his ancestors had been, the master of a large estate with tenants and dependents. But he lived in a timber hall with a hearth in the middle of the floor and a hole in the roof, because the stone house had been unmaintainable and cold, and its roof had failed, and there was nobody left who could make the tiles. He ate off hand-made pots, and a few precious heirloom vessels that were kept for feasts. He could read a little, taught by a priest, and his sons could not. He had a Latin name in the church records and a British name at home. He wore British wool and a brooch that had been made in his grandmother's time. He kept armed men around him and fed them at his table, and that arrangement, a lord with a warband kept by hospitality, is not a Roman arrangement at all. It is what people do when there is no state, and it is the beginning of the world we call medieval. What about the towns? The towns took longer than people used to think, and shorter than the Romantics would like. In several of them there is clear evidence of life continuing well into the 5th century, with timber buildings inside the walls, with a market of some kind, with churches, with the walls kept in repair, because walls are the one Roman thing that stays useful. But the town as an economic idea had lost its point. A Roman town existed to be a market, an administrative centre, and a place to display civic wealth. Take away the tax system and the long-distance trade and the coin, and there is very little reason for 2,000 people to live inside a wall in a country of farms. So they thinned out. Some kept a bishop and a congregation. Some became a fortified refuge that people went into when there was trouble and left again in the spring. Some were simply farmed inside the walls. And in the north, the forts on the wall, which had been garrisoned continuously for 280 years, did not so much close as forget. There is a fort where, long after the last coin arrived, somebody built a timber hall inside the ruined headquarters building, on a floor of flagstones, with a hearth. The unit was still there, its descendants were still there. They still called themselves by the regiment's name for a while perhaps, in the way that families keep titles. And the Great Wall itself, 80 miles of it, stopped being a frontier and became a quarry and a road and a boundary between fields, and, in time, a wonder that nobody could explain. The 5th century in Britain is the darkest room in our history. And I mean that literally, because there is almost no light in it. Between the last Roman official leaving and the first Anglo-Saxon churchman writing things down, there is a stretch of about 150 years, for which we have perhaps 4 contemporary sources, none of them what a historian would call reliable, and an archaeology that is very hard to date, because the coins and the pottery that dated everything before have stopped. So we grope. But here is the shape of it, as best we can see. The Britons who had thrown out the imperial officials did not intend to leave the empire. They intended to be part of a properly run empire that would come back to them. For at least a generation they behaved like Romans temporarily on their own. There is a letter written by a British Christian at the very time of the collapse, and it is not about barbarians at all. It is about theology, and it is written in fluent educated Latin by a man who assumes his reader is a member of the Roman intellectual world, which he was. There is a bishop who came from Gaul to Britain twice in the middle of the 5th century to settle a doctrinal dispute, and the account of his visit describes a country still with towns, still with a landed gentry who dressed richly, still with churches and organised congregations, still with roads he could travel on. He is even described as helping a British force defeat raiders by having them all shout a hymn in a valley so that the echo terrified the enemy, which is a lovely story whether or not it is true, and which tells you the countryside was Christian enough for a whole army to know the response. And there is the famous appeal, recorded a century later, in which the Britons wrote to the great general of the Western Empire and said that the barbarians drive them to the sea and the sea drives them back to the barbarians, and that between these two kinds of death they are either slaughtered or drowned. No help came. The general was fighting for the life of Gaul with an army he no longer really had. But then, alongside that, and this is where it gets genuinely complicated, The newcomers were already here and had been for a long time, and many of them had been invited. There were Germanic soldiers in the late Roman army in Britain, as there were everywhere in the late Roman army, and there were Germanic families settled in the eastern part of the province in the 4th century as garrison troops with land. The very earliest Anglo-Saxon-style burials in England are found near Roman towns and in Roman cemeteries, sometimes with Roman military belt fittings. So the beginning of the change looks less like an invasion and more like the last chapter of the Roman practice of hiring frontier peoples to do the defending, and then not being able to pay them. The tradition that the later English remembered, and that a British monk writing furiously about a century afterwards also remembered, is precisely that. A British ruler, faced with raiders from the north, hired Saxon mercenaries and settled them in the east and paid them in supplies, and when the supplies fell short they mutinied, and once they had mutinied they sent home for their families and their neighbours, and the trickle became a migration. Whether tens of thousands came or only a few thousand who then set the fashion is one of the great unsettled arguments, and the honest answer is that both happened in different regions at different times. What is not in doubt is the outcome. Over the 5th and 6th centuries, the eastern half of what is now England became a country of Germanic speech, of hall and warband and a very different set of gods, of hand-made pottery and timber halls and cremations in urns, and the Latin and British speech of that region went out like a light. Meanwhile in the west, in the peninsula of the southwest, in Wales, in the northwest, the Roman descended aristocracy kept going for a long time. They set up kingdoms with British names ruled by men whose titles were sometimes Latin, one of them literally derived from the word for a general commanding a district. They put up memorial stones in Latin, in the Roman lettering, saying that a certain man, son of a certain man, lies here, and they went on doing it for 200 years after the last governor left. They imported wine and oil from the Mediterranean by sea in the 6th century into a fortified hilltop in the West Country, and the broken jars are still there in the ground, which means that somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean there was a captain who knew where Britain was and thought the voyage worth making. 150 years after the empire let go, and out of that western, Latin-flavoured, Christian, half-remembered Roman world came all the legends. The war leader who held back the newcomers, the last Roman general of a country that was no longer Roman, the battle at a hill that nobody can find, the dream of a lost golden order, and a lawful past. That is the true origin of the greatest story this island ever told, and it grew in the gap between the last Mosaic and the first Chronicle. Now let us be careful here, because the popular version of all this is usually one of two extremes, and neither is right. The first extreme is that Roman civilization was wiped out in fire and blood by savage invaders, and Britain fell into a darkness for 600 years. The second is that nothing much happened, the villas gently changed hands, and the whole thing was a peaceful transition. The truth is more interesting and more human than either. Materially, the fall was steep and real and worse than any comparable region of the Western Empire. Britain lost coinage, wheel-made pottery, mortared masonry, large-scale industry, long-distance trade and literate administration faster and more completely than Gaul or Spain or Italy, and it did so because Britain was the province whose Romanness had been most dependent on the presence of the state and its army and the flow of money that came with them. Take that away in Italy, and there is still a rich landowning society with a market and a church. Take it away in Britain, and there is a farming island with the plumbing switched off. But socially, the continuities are everywhere. The people did not go. The population of Britain in the year 500 was overwhelmingly descended from the population of Britain in the year 400. The fields kept their shapes, and in many parts of England the boundaries of Roman estates are still faintly there under the parish boundaries. The roads kept being walked. The church kept a thread of Latin literacy alive in the west, and that thread ran to Ireland, and Ireland sent it back into northern Britain a century later, and it is one of the great quiet rescues in European history. So the honest way to put it is this: Roman Britain did not fall. It was switched off region by region over about 3 generations, and the people who lived through it mostly did not know it was happening, because the process by which a way of life ends is almost always slower and duller than the story we tell about it afterwards. There was no last Roman. There was only a long series of ordinary mornings in which one more thing that had always been available simply was not. And people made do, and their children did not know it had ever been otherwise. And yet almost nothing was truly lost, in the sense that almost nothing was truly removed. It was simply left lying about, and Britain has been walking over it ever since. Consider the roads. When the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms grew up, they did not build roads, but they used the ones that were there, and they gave them new names, and those names are still on the map, and the great road running northwest from the old port across the Midlands still bears the name the English gave it after a legendary king. When the Normans came, they marched on Roman roads. When the first turnpikes were built in the 18th century, many were laid directly on top of Roman alignments because the engineers found the old bed underneath and used it as hardcore. The main road going north out of the capital, the main road going west, the road along the south coast, the road through the Midlands, they are all, in long stretches, following a line set by a man with a wooden cross and a plumb line before the birth of the Emperor Trajan. Consider the towns. Of the 20 or so major Roman towns of Britain, almost every one is still a town. Some are great cities and some are pleasant market towns, and 1 or 2 are quiet villages, but the sites were chosen so well, at the crossing places and the harbours and the heads of navigation, that once the Middle Ages needed towns again, they grew back in almost exactly the same spots. Walk in the old centre of a dozen English cities, and the street plan under your feet is a Roman street plan modified, and the medieval city wall you are admiring is standing on a Roman foundation. And the reason the modern high street bends where it bends is that it is going around the ruin of something that was demolished 1,000 years before the shop was built. Consider the names. There is a Latin word that means a walled town or a camp, and when the English arrived and found these strange empty stone places, they took the word into their own language and attached it to them. And so we have all the towns in England ending in the syllables Chester, and Caster, and Cester. Every one of those names is an Anglo-Saxon acknowledgement that somebody enormous had been here first. There is a Latin word for a colony, sitting inside the name of a city in the east. There is the Latin word for a spring or a bath in the name of another. And in the far west, in the Welsh language, hundreds of ordinary Latin words survive as the perfectly normal everyday words of a living tongue, so that a Welsh speaker asking for a bridge, or a window, or a book, or a fish, or a knife or wine, or a church, is using a word that a legionary would have understood. That is the deepest survival of all, because it is in people's mouths. Consider the shape of the land itself. In parts of Norfolk and Essex and on the chalk downs, the pattern of small fields laid out in the Roman period is still visible from the air as faint lines, and in some places the modern hedges follow them. Roman drainage on the fen edge determined where you can still farm. Roman quarries left the hollows on the hillside. Roman lead mining left the spoil heaps where nothing grows well even now. And then there is the wall, which is the greatest survival and the strangest. For centuries it was simply a fact of the landscape in the north, too big to explain and too useful to leave alone. Farmers took stone from it for barns and byres and field walls, and if you walk certain lanes in Northumberland, you can see Roman facing stones, dressed and squared, built into a wall around a sheep pasture, and sometimes a fragment of a carved inscription upside down in a barn. A church was built out of a fort. A whole medieval priory was built out of another one, with a Roman tombstone reused as an altar step. In the middle of the 18th century, a military road was constructed along the north of England after a rebellion, and the engineers ran it, for miles, straight along the top of the wall, using the Roman foundation and taking the Roman stone, and that is why some stretches are gone entirely, and why other stretches survive so well, because the road turned aside there. What people made of it in the meantime is one of the loveliest things in this whole story. The Anglo-Saxons, coming upon the ruins of Roman Britain, did not know who had built them, and they assumed the answer was giants. There is a poem in Old English, written perhaps 300 years after the end, describing a ruined Roman city, probably the bathing town in the west, with its fallen roofs and its broken towers and its hot streams that once ran into stone basins, and the poet calls the whole thing the work of giants, wondrous, and says that the builders are held fast in the earth's grip, and that fate has broken it. Whoever wrote that stood in the ruin of a bathhouse, looked at the vaults, and understood exactly what he was looking at without knowing a single fact about it. He knew it had been a city of people who had been happy, and that they had gone. Then, very slowly, Britain remembered. In the 16th century, antiquaries began riding about the country with notebooks, copying inscriptions and arguing about which town was which. In the 18th century, gentlemen dug up mosaics on their estates and built little houses over them and charged for admission. In the 19th century, the railways cut through everything and turned up Roman Britain by the wagon load. In the 20th, aerial photography arrived, and suddenly, from the air, in the right light of a dry summer, the buried ditches showed as darker lines in the crop and the buried walls as paler ones, and whole forts and villas and field systems appeared out of an apparently empty field. And the map of Roman Britain doubled in a decade. And in our own time, the great instrument has been the digger's mud again, and the metal detector, and the chemistry of bones and teeth, which can now tell us where a person grew up from the oxygen in their enamel, and the answers have been startling. There is a woman buried in the southern suburb of Roman London whose bones say she grew up somewhere with a warm climate, buried in a lead coffin with jet and a decanter. There are men in a northern cemetery whose isotopes say North Africa. There is a young man buried in the far southwest whose signature says the Eastern Mediterranean. This island was not homogeneous then any more than it is now, and the evidence for that is not an argument, it is chemistry. Let us take one last slow walk through it all before we let the story go. And let us walk it the way you would on a soft grey afternoon with nothing to do. Begin on the crags in the north, where the wall runs along the edge of a great sheet of dark rock that tilts up out of the moor and drops away in a cliff on its northern side. The builders used that cliff because a wall on top of a crag is worth 3 walls on a plain. Up there the wall is at its most complete. You can put your hand on the facing stones, which are small, roughly the size of a loaf, deliberately made small so that one man could carry and place them all day without stopping, with a rubble and mortar core between the two faces. You can walk from a turret to a mile castle and see the door jambs and the pivot hole where the gate turned. Below on one side there is a small deep lake, black and still, with reeds. On the other, the fields run away south towards the valley. There is almost always wind. And in that wind, for 280 years, somebody stood, in a cloak, with cold hands, wanting the watch to end. Come down off the crags to the fort in the valley, where the mud kept the letters. There is a gate with the ruts of the wagon wheels worn into the threshold stones, 2 grooves, deep as your hand, cut by iron tyres over 3 centuries. Nothing in the whole of Roman Britain says traffic like those 2 grooves. There is the courtyard house of the commander with its private bath, and there is a latrine block, and there is a workshop and a hospital, and a great deal of level green grass where the barracks were. Go south down the road, through the country of low hills and long stone walls, to the northern capital where the emperor died, and stand in the undercroft of the cathedral, where the corner of the legionary headquarters is still standing, painted plaster and all under the medieval piers, with the modern city on top of the medieval city on top of the fortress. Go on south, along the line of the great road, to the towns, to the place in the Midlands where the Roman city was never rebuilt over, so the entire street grid lies under a field of grass and sheep, and you can see the humps of the buildings when the light is low. That is the rarest thing in Britain, a Roman town in a meadow, with its amphitheatre as a dish in the turf, and its walls as a bank in the hedge. And no cars. Go west to the bathing town, and down the steps into the green steaming water under the arches, where the lead lining laid in the 1st century is still holding, and the spring still delivers its 250,000 gallons a day at the same heat it has kept since before there were people here to notice. Somewhere in the museum there, behind glass, are the curses, the little sheets of lead about the stolen bathing tunic, and the 6 missing coins, and the models of hands and eyes, and the coins thrown in for luck. Go into the Cotswold valleys and find the villa in the wood, where you walk in under a modern roof, and there below you is a floor of small stones laid by a man who is paid to do it, showing the seasons and the sea and the old stories. And in the middle of the floor, if the villa is one of the ones I am thinking of, there is a patch where the pattern is interrupted, because at some point somebody put a fire there. Go to the coast in the southeast and stand inside a Saxon shore fort, in a great empty green rectangle, with walls 30 feet high all round and bastions at the corners, and the sea a field away, and gulls, and a level place in the grass where the granaries were. Go to the port on the Thames and look for it, because it is the hardest to see and the most everywhere. A piece of the city wall in a garden between office blocks, with the courses of red tile running through it. The oval outline of the amphitheatre painted on the floor of a modern courtyard, so that you can see how big it was as you crossed to buy a coffee. The temple of the bull slaying god, taken up and relaid in a basement, where they play the sound of a crowd in an ancient street and the lamps come up in the dark, and it is a reconstruction, and it is also, undeniably, the actual stones. Under a bank, a fragment of a quay. In a museum case, a leather bikini bottom worn by an acrobat, a pair of child's shoes with the toes worn through, a comb, a set of surgical instruments, a wooden tablet on which a man writes to say that he has heard the market is doing well and asks whether the money has arrived. And in one case, a small round tin with the cream still in it, with the finger marks. That is Roman Britain. Not the emperors who came twice and left quickly. Not the battles, which were rare and are mostly unfindable. It is a woman's fingerprints in cold cream, and 2 ruts in a gate, and a soldier asking for socks, and a curse about a stolen towel, and a father counting his daughter's life in days, and a Syrian widower writing 1 word in his own alphabet on a stone in the north wind. 400 years, longer than the time from the first Elizabeth to now. Long enough for a family to live in one valley through 15 generations and see the round house become a farmhouse, become a villa, become a ruin, become a barn. Long enough that people were born, lived and died inside it, without ever once imagining that it might be temporary. Which is a thing worth thinking about gently as you fall asleep, without alarm. Because it is simply how all of us live, in every age, and it is not sad. It is only how time works. The Britons of the year 300 thought the world had always had roads and would always have coins. We think the world has always had electricity and will always have aeroplanes. Neither of us is wrong to think so. We are simply standing in the middle of something and cannot see the ends of it, and that is a comfortable place to stand, and it is where you are now, warm, in the dark, at the end of a long story. So let us gather it up, very slowly, the way you would fold a blanket at the end of an evening, and then we will let it rest. It began with frightened men on a beach in Gaul who did not want to sail beyond the edge of the known world, and a freed slave who made them laugh until the fear let go. It began with an unopposed landing on a shingle shore and a ditch dug before anything else, because that is what these people did. It began with a fortnight's visit from an emperor with elephants, and the submission of 11 kings, and an arch in Rome that nobody in Britain ever saw. Then came the roads going over the hills instead of around them, and the census and the small bronze coins that let a person sell 4 eggs, and the market days, and the Latin that the ambitious learned and the children of the ambitious learned better. Then came the rising in the east, and the 3 burnt cities, and the layer of red and black under the pavements, and the decision afterwards not to punish a province into a desert, because a desert pays no tax. Then the long grind west into the mountains, and north into the moors, and the 7 tons of nails buried in a workshop floor by an army walking away from a fortress it had just finished building. Then the emperor with the beard, who drew a line and said, "Here and no further," and 80 miles of stone went up across the neck of the island, white rendered on a clear day, with a gate at every mile and a fort every few, manned by Spaniards and Syrians and men from the Rhine Delta, who stayed and married and had children who had never seen home. Then 250 years of ordinary life on that line, of rosters and beer and oysters and pepper from India and eye ointment and a letter about socks, of the villages outside the gates where 4 languages ran together, of a spring where 13,000 coins were thrown for luck, of a temple in a hollow where the wind stopped, of a Syrian merchant burying his British wife and writing 1 word in his own script. Then the province in its comfort, the port on the Thames with the largest hall north of the Alps and quays growing out into the river, the hot spring in the west with its curses in the water, the 20 towns with their grids and their forums, the 1,000 villas with their painted rooms and their heated floors and their pictures of Mediterranean seas laid by men who had never seen one, the wool and the lead and the salt and the grey cooking pots that went everywhere, the slaves who stoked it, whose names we do not have. Then the hard century, the coins that were less silver each year, the money in the ground, the 10 years when Britain had its own emperor and its own better coinage and its own slogans, the great sea castles on the eastern shore with walls 30 feet high, the town gates narrowed, the tombstones of grandparents built into the defences, and then, astonishingly, the richest century of all, the great courtyard villas, the mosaics of the seasons, the 80 pounds of buried silver, the pepper pot shaped like a lady, the Christ on a floor with hunting scenes in the border and a mother goddess in a niche by the kitchen door. Then the subtraction. The bad year when the frontier failed on 3 sides at once and the scouts had been taking bribes, and the general who came and put it back together for one last time. The commanders who reached for the throne and took the garrison to Gaul and never returned it, 3 times over. The crossing of the frozen river on the continent that cut the road to Italy, and the coins that stopped arriving, which was not a battle and not a siege and not a fire, but simply a payroll ending, and which did more than any army could have done. Then the tax revolt, and the officials expelled, and the letter that came back saying, "Look to your own defences." And then the long quiet, the kilns going cold, the last wheel-thrown pot, the corn dryer built on the mosaic, the hearth laid on the picture of the sea, the roof tiles carried away by the neighbours, the timber hall inside the ruined headquarters, the stone house that no one could re-roof, and the good timber house that went up beside it, and the family still there, still farming, still important locally, no longer Roman and not yet anything else. And afterwards the giant's work standing in the fields unexplained, and the poet who looked at a ruined bathhouse and knew, without a single fact, that people had once been happy there. That is the entire story. 4 centuries, from a mutiny on a beach to a shrug in a letter, and everything in between lived by people who got up in the dark and banked the fire and worried about the weather and wanted their feet to be warm. Nothing in it was ever as fast as the summary makes it sound. Every change in this story took a lifetime, and most of the people in it never knew they were in a story at all. Which brings us gently to the end. If you are still here, let the last of it go now. Let the beach go, and the ships. Let the roads go, running away straight over the hills into the rain. Let the white line on the northern crags go, with a small figure walking the top of it in the wind. Let the hot rooms go, and the steam, and the sound of voices coming back off a painted ceiling. Let the family in the valley go, all 15 generations of them, one after another, ploughing the same red soil. They are all resting now, every one of them, under the fields and the roads and the towns, and they have been resting for a very long time, and they rest well. There is nothing left in this story that needs anything from you. So let your breathing slow. Let the weight of you settle down through the mattress. Let your jaw come loose, and your hands go soft, and let the room be dark and warm and quiet around you. The way a roundhouse was warm on a wet January night with the fire banked under the ash and everyone asleep in a ring around it, feet to the middle, safe, with the smoke going up slowly through the thatch and the rain coming down on it, and nothing at all to be done until morning. Sleep well. Good night.